In this video I will mostly focus on sharing my opinion about how our modern way of thinking, often marked by materialism, relativism, and superficial understanding of symbols, especially when driven by political ideologies where everything is increasingly seen through the eyes of politics, is not only wrong, but harmful to life. I believe that essentially politics became a new religion as a consequence of the lack of metaphysically oriented thinking and misunderstanding of metaphysics in the construction of any kind of system in any realm of human thought, and its role in understanding reality itself. I will also argue this position through philosophy of Plato and Hegel, who are often considered by historians of Western philosophy as the first and the last system builders, meaning they were not focusing on specific topics. They covered everything that one complete philosophical system should cover in order to be complete. I will also argue that these thinkers, like Plato and Hegel, who constructed their philosophies as a complete system, taking into consideration all aspects of reality when thinking about each topic, are fundamentally opposed to this modernized, relativized, fragmented kind of thinking. And I will try to show how their kind of thinking led them to completely different understanding of politics, institutions, and construction of philosophical and political theories in general, their place in reality, and their function. Which is why I would say that we can't even compare their understanding of ideas and ideology to such modern ideological positions which we often see in the modern world. My view of philosophy is that it can never be complete without metaphysics. Even when philosophers attempt to avoid metaphysical questions or construct systems that appear independent of metaphysics, they inevitably rely upon metaphysical assumptions. It is impossible to develop any philosophical position without some conception of reality, even if that conception remains implicit and unexamined. A philosopher may never write a single word about metaphysics, yet the moment they begin speaking about knowledge, ethics, politics, science, or any other subject, they have already presupposed some understanding of what it means for something to be real, and with this fact alone, there is already a certainty of metaphysics. Within the Western tradition, Plato is often regarded as the father of philosophy because he was the first thinker to systematically address nearly every major philosophical question that continued to occupy later generations. In many ways, the history of Western philosophy begins with Plato. By writing in the form of dialogues, he established a model in which philosophy became an ongoing conversation extending beyond the lifetime of any individual thinker. Philosophers after him entered into this dialogue, responding to earlier ideas and contributing their own perspectives. Hegel is often seen as the last major philosopher who fully embraced this kind of Platonic ambition of capturing the entirety of philosophy. He attempted to construct a comprehensive system that addressed the totality of reality and integrated all major domains of philosophical inquiry. It is often said that Hegel stands at the boundary between modern and postmodern philosophy. Many regard him as the final great philosopher of the modern period, while those who followed are commonly grouped under the broad category of postmodern thought. What concerns me is that much of the philosophy that emerged after Hegel increasingly neglected metaphysics. In my view, this neglect has had profoundly negative consequences. It represents a departure from the very point at which philosophy begins. At times I find myself wondering whether some thinkers who came after Hegel can truly be called philosophers in the traditional sense if they abandon the foundational questions that gave philosophy its original purpose. This may sound controversial, but I believe the abandonment of metaphysics contributed significantly to the intellectual confusion that characterizes much contemporary thought. Instead of beginning with the foundations of reality and building upward, many modern approaches attempt to begin at the surface. It is as if we tried to construct a building by starting with the roof, while ignoring the foundation and supporting walls. Philosophy becomes detached from the deeper questions that make meaningful inquiry possible. The result is a worldview that grows increasingly superficial and fragmented. One consequence of this shift can be seen in the widespread misunderstanding of Plato. Many people imagine that Plato believed in a strange supernatural realm where numbers and geometric shapes literally float through space as physical objects. This is not what people literally imagine, but most people who dismiss Plato's philosophy give similar absurdities as their justification. They can't even consider what would it mean to have a realm of ideas without imagining it as an absurdity. This is a consequence of the lack of understanding of metaphysics. Consider the simple example of the number 2. What exactly is the number 2? Is it merely the visual symbol 2 that appears on a screen or a page, or is that symbol simply a representation of something deeper? The symbol itself is not the number. It is a sign that points toward a meaning. Yet once metaphysics is removed from the discussion, numbers become nothing more than arbitrary marks invented by human beings. Their connection to reality becomes difficult to explain. The same problem extends to every aspect of existence. Without metaphysics, things lose their deeper significance. Reality is reduced to appearances and symbols, without any account of the meaning that makes those symbols intelligible. Yet as soon as we acknowledge that something is real, we have already entered the realm of metaphysics. Metaphysics is nothing more than the investigation of reality itself. It asks what it means for something to be real and what conditions make reality possible. A philosophical system that never addresses these questions remains incomplete, yet even an incomplete system still contains assumptions about reality. The moment we speak about anything, we implicitly treat that thing as real in some sense. Thus, metaphysical commitments remain present whether we recognize them or not. One cannot escape metaphysics simply by refusing to discuss it. Without metaphysics, meaning itself becomes difficult to account for. The number 2 becomes merely an empty symbol that somehow manages to describe reality. But this immediately raises a deeper question. How can a symbol represent reality at all? What is the connection between the symbol and the thing it signifies? Why are human beings able to understand these symbols and use them to communicate truths about the world? The answer, in my view, is that reality is meaningful at its very core. Thought is meaningful, structures are meaningful. Things are not merely collections of surfaces and appearances. They possess an intelligible character that can be grasped by the mind. There is something about the structure of reality itself that invites understanding. Metaphysics is the attempt to investigate this deeper dimension of meaning upon which everything else depends. This is why philosophy must begin with foundations. Philosophy should function as a mirror of reality. If reality possesses a fundamental structure, then a philosophical system must reflect that structure if it is to provide genuine understanding. A distorted foundation produces a distorted reflection. Once that occurs, entire systems of thought emerge that misrepresent reality and shape human behavior according to those misrepresentations. When our conceptual mirror becomes distorted, our beliefs gradually pull us away from reality rather than toward it. We begin to organize our lives around images and abstractions that no longer correspond to the world itself. This creates a tension between our understanding of reality and the reality we actually inhabit. As a result, we increasingly struggle against the very conditions of our own existence. I believe this tendency can already be observed in many contemporary ideologies. Symbols, language, and appearances often become more important than the realities they were originally intended to represent. Political and cultural movements frequently organize themselves around superficial categories while losing sight of the deeper truths those categories were meant to express. The image replaces the reality, and preserving the image becomes more important than understanding what it points toward. In this sense, many modern ideological conflicts revolve around symbols detached from genuine meaning. People become invested in labels, slogans, and linguistic constructions while neglecting the realities those symbols were meant to illuminate. What matters is no longer whether an idea corresponds to reality, but whether it preserves a particular conceptual framework. The distorted mirror becomes more important than the world it reflects. For this reason, I believe metaphysics is not primarily concerned with supernatural entities or mystical speculation. Metaphysics is ultimately about reality itself. If physics studies how reality behaves, then metaphysics asks a prior question: what is this reality that physics investigates? Physics explores the patterns and laws governing the world, while metaphysics examines the conditions that make such investigation possible in the first place. Metaphysics therefore stands behind every other inquiry. It asks why reality is intelligible, why knowledge is possible, and what kind of thing reality must be for science, thought, and experience to occur at all. Far from being an escape from the world, Metaphysics is the attempt to understand the foundations upon which our entire understanding of the world depends. It is often understood that metaphysics means something that isn't directly real, but the opposite is true. Metaphysics is about reality, and to reject it at the same time means to reject reality. But people who do not understand this will tell you that metaphysical thinking is about abstractions, while they are actually the ones who don't believe in metaphysics, which at the end leads them to dismiss concrete reality. And it is precisely when metaphysics is dismissed where everything becomes abstracted and relativized. This is precisely why I believe that the non-metaphysical foundations upon which many modern philosophies and ideologies are built should ultimately be rejected. More than any other reason, this is what separates thinkers such as Plato and Hegel from most contemporary political, philosophical, and ideological categories. All other differences follow from this fundamental divide. Plato and Hegel sought to connect their concepts directly to the structure of reality itself. Their ethical and political ideas were not merely collections of slogans, conventions, or social preferences. They believed that concepts such as justice, goodness, beauty, truth, and reason possess a reality of their own. In fact, both thinkers would argue that these realities are more fundamental and more real than anything else. When philosophy or political thought is detached from the nature of reality, it becomes an exercise in speculation without direction. If we assume that we can construct systems according to personal preference, arbitrary assumptions, or social fashion, without considering whether those systems correspond to reality itself, then we are no longer seeing clearly. We are merely guessing. We move forward without any reliable guide, creating structures whose relationship to truth remains unknown. By reality, I do not mean merely the conditions of a particular society, the organization of an economy, the laws of a state, voting procedures, or the cultural norms of a given period. These are secondary manifestations rather than reality in its deepest sense. They are expressions, symbols, and consequences of something more fundamental. Modern thought often mistakes these surface-level categories for reality itself. Political slogans, ideological identities, and social narratives become substitutes for genuine inquiry. Yet these things are not reality. They are representations that point towards something deeper. The problem is that many people no longer believe there is anything beneath the surface to investigate. If one assumes that reality consists entirely of political positions, social constructions, and competing ideologies, then there is no reason to search beyond them. In my view, however, the opposite is true. These symbolic and ideological structures rest upon a deeper reality of meaning that exists independently of whether we acknowledge it, but if we don't acknowledge it, it becomes almost impossible to truly understand what is beneficial and what is harmful. Because if we live in a meaningful reality, benefit and harm depend on our ability to recognize this meaningful structure we participate in, and our understanding of it allows us to properly position ourselves in respect to this structure and find our meaningful place within it. Reality possesses a nature of its own, and philosophy must attempt to understand that nature rather than invent it. There is such a thing as goodness. Goodness is not simply a human preference or a collection of laws imposed upon society. Laws themselves are only symbols. They may express goodness, distort it, or fail to embody it altogether, but they are not identical with goodness itself. Beneath every law, custom, or institution lies a deeper meaning that gives it significance. If we wish to understand what goodness truly is, we must look beyond the symbols and seek the reality they attempt to represent. The same can be said of beauty. Beauty is not something we create through arbitrary decision. We do not collectively vote something into being beautiful. Beauty possesses its own intelligible character. The arrangement of a city, the design of a building, or the content of an advertisement are not beautiful merely because they exist. These things are symbols and expressions that may participate in beauty to varying degrees, but beauty itself transcends them. The symbol is not the reality. It can reflect beauty, but it cannot replace it. This is no different from the example of the number 2. It is merely a visual representation of a meaning that exists independently of the symbol. The same principle applies throughout reality. The structures we create, whether political, cultural, or social, are symbolic forms. Their significance depends upon the deeper meanings they express. Reality resides not in the symbols alone, but in the ideas and meanings toward which those symbols point. At the same time, even symbols themselves are meaningful. They are not disconnected from reality. I used to think that language is an arbitrary construction of our making, but I came to realize it is a rational product of reality itself. One could see the entire reality as a kind of language, and our human language is just another symbolic structure that reflects it. If we are a rational product of spirit, then even our language, as the extension of our own reason, is in itself a rational product of spirit or the world soul. But the problem is that we don't see the true meaning in language anymore. Like we increasingly strive to remove the truth from our language, it is as if we are deliberately trying to separate language from truth. But they are inseparable, and not understanding this will bring great confusion in society. It already has, and as I see it, it is becoming worse with each passing day. The problem with much modern non-metaphysical thought is not that it uses symbols, but that it loses sight of the meanings those symbols are meant to represent. The connection between symbol and reality ultimately depends upon human consciousness. It depends upon our capacity to recognize the idea expressed through the symbol. In other words, the crisis is not primarily a crisis of language or representation. It is a crisis of understanding. This is exactly what Plato and Hegel were attempting to investigate. Their philosophies are fundamentally concerned with ideas, meaning, and the nature of reality itself. Everything participates in reality, whether we recognize it or not. Even when a symbol is misunderstood, it still expresses some aspect of meaning. But if we wish to construct a clear and accurate image of reality, we must first learn to see reality as it truly is. A mirror cannot reflect accurately if it is distorted. Likewise, our philosophical systems cannot guide us properly if they are based upon false assumptions. When we attempt to force reality into categories that do not correspond to its nature, we place ourselves in opposition to reality itself. We begin struggling against the very structure of existence. Yet the barriers we encounter are not imposed by reality. They arise from limitations within our own consciousness. The clearer our awareness becomes, the more clearly we perceive reality as a meaningful order grounded in truth. As our understanding deepens, the conceptual structures we build become better reflections of that truth. We learn how to place each idea in its proper position, just as a skilled builder knows which materials belong in each part of a structure. If, however, we attempt to build without seeing clearly, the result will be unstable and distorted. The structure will fail to reflect reality because it was never constructed according to reality's actual form. This, in my view, is one of the defining problems of modernity. Human consciousness has erected barriers that prevent us from seeing reality in its fullness. We focus on the relative, the symbolic, and the superficial while losing sight of the deeper substance of truth itself. Because we are immersed within this condition, it becomes difficult to recognize. We continue constructing ideologies and social systems that fail to align with human flourishing because we no longer perceive the reality upon which flourishing depends. This situation arises when we abandon the belief that reality possesses an intrinsic nature and an intelligible order. Reality means something. Its structure is not arbitrary, nor is it subject to our preferences. Goodness and beauty are not inventions of human opinion. We do not create them. We participate in them, recognize them, and attempt to align ourselves with them. The more faithfully we do so, the more our lives and institutions reflect reality. The less we do so, the more we confuse symbols with the truths they represent. As long as we continue mistaking appearances for reality, we will remain trapped in a distorted vision of existence. We will continue struggling against reality because we have damaged the mirror through which we attempt to perceive it. To lose contact with meaning is to lose contact with reality itself. It leads us to believe that nothing possesses an intrinsic nature, that everything is reducible to interpretation, convention, or preference. Once this happens, the least substantial and most superficial aspects of reality begin to appear as the most concrete. Opinions become more important than truth, representations become more important than what they represent, and images become more important than reality itself. This is the path toward a genuinely dystopian condition, a world in which people gradually lose their sense of what is real. When the experience of reality becomes disconnected from truth and meaning, society begins to drift further and further away from the conditions that make genuine human flourishing possible. The absence of metaphysics within many modern ideologies represents, in my view, a stage in which reality itself gradually begins to be understood as unreal. What emerges is a kind of negative dialectic between being and non-being, a process whose ultimate direction appears to be the reversal of reality into its opposite. As this development unfolds, society slowly constructs a hierarchy of inverted values. The most meaningful and fundamental aspects of existence are treated as insignificant or illusory, while superficial and secondary things are elevated to the highest position. Entire social and political systems are then built upon this inversion. When such a reversal takes place, beauty is mistaken for ugliness and ugliness for beauty. What is harmful is presented as beneficial, while what is genuinely beneficial is dismissed or ignored. Goodness becomes identified with its opposite, and destructive tendencies are praised as signs of progress. This is why so many political and ideological projects that promise a perfect future ultimately produce conditions that resemble the opposite of what they intended. Utopian visions repeatedly give rise to dystopian realities because they are constructed upon a distorted understanding of reality itself. They attempt to force an inverted image of existence into the world and, in doing so, become trapped in a struggle against the very nature of things. Such systems eventually turn against themselves, consuming the people who sustain them before collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions. Hegel, however, approached history from a fundamentally optimistic perspective. He believed that even conflict, destruction, and suffering participate in a rational process moving toward a higher realization of the good. While I understand why Hegel arrived at this conclusion, I believe his optimism can only be understood through the metaphysical foundations of his philosophy. Hegel viewed reality as permeated by reason, spirit, goodness, and meaning. For him, history was not merely a sequence of events, but the unfolding of a deeper rational order. When human consciousness develops in a way that allows people to perceive the reality of ideas, to recognize goodness, beauty, and truth as genuine aspects of existence, positive outcomes naturally follow. Progress in such a framework is not merely technological or political, it is spiritual and intellectual. Yet I often wonder whether Hegel would maintain the same optimism if he were confronted with the contemporary world. Modern ideologies are increasingly constructed from detached symbols, slogans, and abstractions that often seem disconnected from any deeper foundation. Many of them undermine themselves by simultaneously claiming certainty while denying the existence of truth itself. They insist on the validity of their conclusions while rejecting the possibility of objective meaning. Although I hope that humanity can overcome what I see as the negative spirit of the present age, I am far less optimistic than Hegel regarding the future. Like Hegel, I am a Christian, and I also believe that history possesses a rational direction. However, I do not share the confidence that human beings will naturally overcome their pride, self-deception, and resistance to the deeper order of existence. On the contrary, I suspect that civilization may ultimately move toward some form of catastrophe or purification, not because reality itself is evil, nor because God created a world destined for destruction, but because human beings continually choose paths that lead toward such outcomes. In my view, God grants genuine freedom. Human beings are free to choose how they live, what they pursue, and what values they embrace. The responsibility for these choices belongs to us. Yet while the exercise of freedom is left to humanity, the consequences of that freedom are not determined by us. This distinction is essential. God permits countless possibilities and allows human beings to act according to their will, but the ultimate outcome of those actions unfolds according to a deeper order that transcends individual choice. Freedom, therefore, is not the absence of consequences. We may choose among countless possibilities, but the nature of reality determines what follows from those choices. God does not compel anyone to act in a particular way. Rather, he permits individuals and societies to pursue the paths they desire. The results arise not because God forces them upon us, but because reality itself possesses an intelligible structure that cannot be escaped. This understanding is reflected, in my view, in the story of the fall. The traditional narrative is often interpreted as a tale of punishment, but I see it differently. God created a state of harmony and perfection, yet humanity desired something else. Human beings turned away from that condition and chose a different mode of existence. In his freedom and love, God allowed that choice. The world of suffering, conflict, and mortality is not imposed upon humanity against its will. Rather, it is the consequence of humanity's own orientation toward existence. What makes this difficult to recognize is the extent to which human beings deceive themselves. We often claim to desire peace while acting in ways that perpetuate conflict. We say we seek harmony while fostering division. We ask for justice while pursuing selfish interests. In this sense, our spoken desires do not always reveal what we truly want. The deeper truth is expressed through the way we live and the values we embody. God, therefore, does not respond merely to fleeting wishes or verbal requests. He responds to the deeper reality of what we are. If a society continually chooses actions that generate suffering, then suffering follows. If individuals cultivate ways of being that lead toward destruction, then destruction becomes part of their experience. This is not because God delights in suffering, but because he allows human beings to become what they most fundamentally choose to be. For this reason, I believe that every aspect of human existence unfolds within the context of divine love, even when that existence contains pain and tragedy. Love does not mean preventing every consequence. Sometimes it means allowing freedom to reveal its full implications. Human beings receive not simply what they say they want, but what their deepest orientation toward existence demands. The story of Adam and Eve symbolizes precisely this condition. Humanity was created with the possibility of living in harmony with the divine order, yet it was also given the freedom to turn away from that order. God did not force the choice, nor did he prevent it. Instead, he allowed human beings to define themselves through their own decisions. In that sense, the human condition is shaped not by what God intended us to become against our will, but by what we continually choose to become through the exercise of our freedom. As we already pointed out, this does not mean that human takes the position of God and literally decides about everything that will happen next. Complete freedom means that humans can choose whatever they want even if it leads to their destruction, but they don't get to choose a destructive act and then decide whether this act will lead to destructive consequences. This is what is being decided by God himself, by the way reality is structured according to God's perfect knowledge. In the next section, I will explore the theme of modern ideology by presenting it in contrast to Plato's philosophy, especially focusing on his likely most famous work, The Republic. Plato is a philosopher who by far influenced my thinking the most, and I find him to be at the same time the most influential and one of the most misunderstood philosophers, alongside Hegel, whom we will examine after. Plato is mostly misunderstood in a way that his theories are understood, which I am about to clarify, at least from a certain perspective. But when it comes to Hegel, this is also the case. But there is an additional problem with Hegel where we have numerous kinds of heavily imposed distortions that are mostly accepted as the true Hegelian philosophy, but are not only minor differences, but outright the complete opposite of what Hegel believed, and this is accepted by almost everyone who heard about Hegel. Many critics of Plato focus on the political system presented in the Republic, arguing that it resembles a form of totalitarian rule. However, the Republic is not merely a work of political theory. It is also an exploration of the human soul. Plato begins with an examination of the soul and uses that understanding to construct an ideal state that mirrors the structure of a living organism and reflects the nature of life itself. In a similar way, Hegel later argued that the state is a rational expression of spirit. Both thinkers attempt to ground their political visions in something real and fundamental. For Plato, the human being is essentially a soul with a specific structure that includes reason, desires, emotions, and patterns of behavior. In this sense, The Republic can be understood as one of the earliest psychological works, since the organization of the state is based upon Plato's analysis of the psyche. Many readers compare Plato's ideal state to an Orwellian society in which certain individuals are regarded as superior and therefore granted authority over others. Yet this interpretation reverses Plato's actual position. Plato does not claim that some people are inherently more valuable than others. Rather, he argues that different individuals are naturally suited to different ways of life. Every form of life has its own strengths and limitations, and justice requires that each person find a place within society that corresponds to their nature. Plato maintained that all souls possess the capacity for reason, and therefore the potential to rule. He even argued that both men and women could become philosophers, which was at that time a very progressive position. However, only those who truly achieve philosophical understanding are fit to govern. While he recognized differences in temperament and physical nature, he believed that every soul is capable of rational thought and, through a genuine love of wisdom, can attain noesis, the direct apprehension of eternal truths or forms. For Plato, a just society can only exist if we first understand the eternal form of justice itself. To act justly, we must know what justice means in concrete situations. For example, if a murder is committed, the question becomes what actions would bring about the greatest degree of justice possible. This is the role of the forms, also known as the Platonic ideas. They provide meaning and guidance. If we seek a society that promotes human flourishing, we must understand the timeless truths that should inform our decisions and actions. By aligning ourselves with these truths, we move society closer to the good, which Plato regarded as the highest form. Justice, along with all other forms, participates in the good and derives its significance from it. One way to think about the forms is through a comparison with archetypes, similar to those later discussed by Jung. Yes, Plato believed that ideas or forms are the highest reality independent from anything. Instead of arising from reality, they provide the blueprint for reality itself. But in addition to this, Plato also held that the forms are present within the soul and are expressed through human life. This is especially clear in his theory of memory. Many people imagine that Plato proposed some distant heavenly realm detached from reality, but this interpretation misses the point. Plato was deeply concerned with the concrete world. He observed that reality is constantly changing, and concluded that change itself requires an underlying foundation that remains stable. The accusation that Plato escaped from reality often comes from materialistic or relativistic perspectives that overlook the reality of the mind and the soul. Plato argued that these eternal truths are encountered directly through the soul. The soul participates in the forms, imitates them through action, and embodies them through contemplation. If society is to achieve genuine human flourishing and well-being, we must understand the permanent truths about human nature. Some of these truths are obvious. For example, human beings must eat and drink in order to survive, and this remains true regardless of time or place. Such necessities are part of the eternal structure of what it means to be human. In Kabbalistic thought, Adam is often understood as a Platonic archetype of humanity, containing within himself all human qualities. Adam represents the ideal form of human life. To build a flourishing society, we must understand the nature of this universal human form. Every person is a descendant or expression of Adam, and all people share certain unchanging characteristics that define what they are. The need for nourishment is one example, but there are many others. No matter where or when a human being exists, these fundamental features remain constant because they belong to the very form of humanity. By understanding these enduring facts, we can create social structures that correspond to genuine human needs. In other words, a good society is one that is organized in accordance with the permanent realities of human nature. This is the deeper purpose of Plato's Republic. It is an investigation into the form of human life and the structure of the soul in its universal or Adamic dimension. In a sense, Plato is contemplating Adam itself, the archetypal human being, and from this contemplation he attempts to establish a vision of society grounded in what he discovers about human nature. By examining the qualities that all people share, he seeks to understand how these common features should shape the organization of communal life. From this inquiry into the human soul, he moves toward an inquiry into the state. Just as there is a form of man, there is also a form or idea of the state. The state possesses its own essential nature, containing within itself certain eternal and unchanging characteristics that make it what it is. Like the soul of an individual, the soul of the state can be approached through contemplation and philosophical reflection. One of the permanent features of any state is that it consists of multiple individuals united within a shared community. At its most basic level, a state is a group of people living together within a defined space. Like a human being, the state has a kind of body. Its borders give it shape, whether those borders encompass a small territory or even the entire planet. Even a world state would still possess boundaries, since the planet itself would define its limits. Wherever people gather within a common framework of life, there we find the basic form of the state. Yet the state possesses more than a physical structure. It also has an inner character that arises directly from the souls of those who inhabit it. This inner life can be understood as the soul of the state. It includes laws, customs, traditions, values, institutions, and all the cultural patterns that shape collective existence. In this respect, the state is every bit as complex as an individual person because it is an expression of human souls brought together into a larger whole. It functions as a kind of collective soul, emerging from the many individuals who participate in it. The state, then, has a soul just as individuals have souls. Plato's Republic explores the relationship between the soul of the individual, represented through the universal form of Adam, and the soul of society, represented through the form or idea of the state, which we may call the Republic. Adam and Republic are inseparably connected. If human life is to possess a stable foundation and a clear direction, we must understand the eternal truths that unite the individual with the political community. Only through such understanding can we establish governments that pursue meaningful and concrete goals. For this reason, Plato's Republic should not be interpreted as a literal political blueprint intended for every society and every age. Such an interpretation would be impossible because historical circumstances continually change. The world of Plato was vastly different from our own. The Greek polis was a relatively small community compared to modern cities containing millions of people. Technological conditions, social structures, and historical realities were entirely different. It is therefore mistaken to judge the Republic solely by the standards of its particular historical setting. Its enduring value lies elsewhere. The work should be understood as a theoretical model that reveals what is most important when investigating the foundations of government and civilization. The lasting significance of the Republic does not come from its specific social arrangements, but from the deeper principles it explores. In this sense, the dialogue becomes a kind of form in its own right, directing attention toward realities that transcend ordinary political theory. Plato is less concerned with temporary historical conditions than with the eternal ideas that underlie them. He seeks to show how human beings can reach a state of understanding in which the forms become accessible through contemplation, providing universal truths capable of guiding action within changing historical circumstances. The Republic should therefore be read not primarily as a description of a particular government, but as an exploration of the eternal principles that shape both the soul of man and the soul of the state. It is an inquiry into the connection between these two realities, a connection that finds its highest expression in the form of justice. This is why the dialogue carries the subtitle on justice. Justice stands at the center of the entire work. When the souls of individuals are properly harmonized with the soul of the political community, justice emerges. A just government is the result of this alignment. Human beings participate in and embody justice by bringing the individual soul into accord with the soul of the state, thereby reflecting the form of justice as fully as possible within the world. In the Republic, the ruling class and the guardians are prohibited from owning private wealth or property. They are also denied the traditional family structure, and their children are raised under the authority of the state rather than within private households. Interestingly, these restrictions do not apply to the producing class, which is permitted to possess property, wealth, and family life. This arrangement stands in stark contrast to the modern global order, where political elites and economic oligarchs often accumulate immense wealth and influence, while those at the bottom bear the consequences of their decisions. Plato would argue that such a condition emerges from ignorance. By ignorance, he does not simply mean a lack of information, but a failure to understand the deeper realities and meanings that underlie human existence. It is impossible to govern properly without some knowledge of the universal human form we have called Adam, the soul of humanity as a whole, as well as the form of the state, which is the soul of the political community. This is why Plato insists that philosophers should rule. The philosopher is concerned with precisely these questions and seeks to create the highest possible harmony between the soul of the people and the soul of the state, thereby aligning with the idea of justice and the good. Many readers have also asked why Plato rarely discusses slavery in the Republic. He doesn't create the class of slaves, for example, despite the fact that slavery was common among the elites of his time. Some conclude that he omitted the subject because slavery was so ordinary and unquestioned in Greek society that it required no explanation. There may be some truth in this interpretation, but it does not fully capture the deeper logic of the dialogue. In a symbolic sense, the true slaves of Plato's ideal state are the rulers themselves. The philosopher-king willingly accepts a life of service to the state and to the people who live within it. He understands that he is not separate from the community, but is a part of its living soul. If he governs badly and leads society toward corruption or destruction, he damages not only others but himself as well. The ruler's fate is inseparable from the fate of the state. Another aspect of Plato's thought that frequently attracts criticism is his idea of the noble lie. Many people see a contradiction between Plato's devotion to truth and his willingness to permit what he calls a noble lie. Yet from Plato's perspective there is no contradiction. If a belief or narrative serves the realization of the good, then it is not opposed to truth in the deepest sense. Misunderstandings arise when Plato is interpreted as someone who abandoned reality in favor of abstract speculation. In fact, Plato's philosophy is fundamentally concerned with life as it is lived. The highest goal is to align oneself with the good and to embody it in action. If a noble lie contributes to this alignment, then it is not viewed as a malicious deception, but as an instrument through which a higher truth can be realized. Its value lies not in falsehood itself, but in its ability to guide human beings toward a better way of life. For this reason, the noble lie should not be understood as a mechanism by which rulers manipulate the population for their own advantage. Such a situation would represent the very opposite of Plato's intention and would resemble the tendencies of tyranny rather than justice. In Plato's ideal state, it is the rulers and guardians who must accept the noble lie. They must internalize a vision that encourages them to sacrifice personal interests for the common good. Human beings naturally possess selfish desires, and throughout history those in power have often exploited political authority for private gain. The noble lie functions as a remedy against this tendency. Its purpose is to shape rulers who are willing to surrender wealth, property, status, and even the ordinary privileges of family life so that they may dedicate themselves entirely to the well-being of the community. In this sense, the noble lie is directed not primarily at the ruled, but at everyone, and I would argue it is primarily directed at the rulers, requiring them to see themselves as servants of society rather than its masters. Plato criticized democracy because he believed it lacked the stable structure necessary for a society to function in harmony with the souls of its citizens. In his view, democracy tends to dissolve distinctions, responsibilities, and guiding principles, eventually producing disorder rather than genuine freedom. This is why he placed aristocracy at the top of his hierarchy of political systems. Yet the meaning of aristocracy in Plato's philosophy is often misunderstood. Many people associate it with oppression, privilege, or authoritarian rule. For Plato, however, aristocracy is not defined by the social status of those who govern, but by their relationship to the good. Those who are capable of recognizing, understanding, and embodying the good are the ones most suited to leadership. The criterion is not birth, wealth, race, or class, but wisdom and virtue. From this perspective, aristocracy is not discriminatory. The question is not who someone is, but whether they possess the knowledge necessary to guide society toward human flourishing. If the aim is genuinely the benefit of the whole community, then leadership is not a privilege granted to elevate some above others, but a responsibility directed toward the common good. Those who understand the importance of goodness naturally seek leaders who can help realize it within society. Furthermore, every citizen remains an essential part of the political community. Each person contributes to the life of the state and participates in its movement toward flourishing. Aristocracy, in its original sense, literally means rule by the best. For Plato, the best are not the richest, strongest, or most powerful, but those who have the deepest understanding of what is good. This understanding has nothing to do with claims of racial superiority or class domination. As we have already seen, Plato's rulers are expected to surrender personal wealth, private property, and many ordinary privileges in order to dedicate themselves entirely to the welfare of the state. Such a system cannot easily be described as discriminatory when its purpose is not the enrichment of a select group, but the well-being of all. Most people desire the best possible life and the best possible society, yet Plato's criticism is that many fail to recognize that the pursuit of the good must be the highest priority. Everything else should be secondary to this goal. If every individual clearly understood what is truly good and acted accordingly, social conflict would largely disappear. Human beings would naturally cooperate in creating a flourishing society. The tragedy, according to Plato, is that ignorance of the good often leads people to support decisions that damage the state and ultimately harm themselves and future generations. The requirement that rulers renounce wealth and property further demonstrates that Plato's ideal leaders are not concerned with material advantages. Their focus is directed toward values themselves. They are less interested in the external and historical features of government, such as specific laws, institutions, or political arrangements, and more concerned with the realities that these structures are meant to express. Laws and constitutions are symbols of deeper truths such as justice, goodness, and order. The philosopher seeks to look beyond these symbolic forms and understand the realities they represent. Rather than becoming attached to particular legal systems or political models, the lover of wisdom asks whether these systems genuinely embody justice and contribute to the good. For this reason, the central political question is not merely who governs or what institutional structure is adopted. The more important question is whether the symbolic framework of society truly reflects goodness. Every political order exists because individuals collectively agree to recognize and participate in a particular set of laws, customs, and institutions. In this sense, government is fundamentally an idea shared within collective consciousness. Its reality depends upon the beliefs and commitments of the people who sustain it. The laws and customs of a society are meaningful only because they point beyond themselves to deeper values. These values originate in the realm of ideas and become embodied through individual souls as well as through the soul of the community as a whole. This is ultimately what Plato means by aristocracy. It is not merely a political arrangement, but an ideal toward which societies strive. A perfectly aristocratic society may never fully exist because complete knowledge of the good, justice, and the other forms is beyond the reach of most human beings. Indeed, even a single individual can almost certainly never possess a perfect understanding of these realities. Nevertheless, the task remains the same. Human beings must attempt to imitate the forms as closely as possible and embody their values within the world. By doing so, they bring individual souls and the soul of society into greater harmony with goodness, love, and the ultimate source from which all reality emerges. When I examine contemporary liberal democracy through a Platonic lens, I see a political order that combines elements of all three of the corrupted regimes Plato identified: oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. The oligarchic aspect reveals itself in the immense importance assigned to wealth and the influence that wealth can purchase. Within a capitalist democracy whose values have become distorted, individuals who are willing to abandon moral restraints often gain significant advantages. To be completely clear, I am not criticizing capitalism in itself. I am criticizing the values in human consciousness that are manifested in capitalism and as such shape society. If human consciousness remains the same, even if you replace capitalism with something else, you will get similar results. These are symbols for deeper meaning. Capitalism is nothing but a symbol for values in human consciousness. If we wish to reshape society, we need to reshape our orientation towards certain values. If we don't, even if you replace capitalism with communism, you will get exactly same kinds of issues that arise from selfishness, greed, and hubris. I do not mind capitalism nor communism as long as they are aligned with proper values. I don't care about political systems. I want to know what they represent in reality, not in theory, and this entirely depends on human consciousness, which right now is on a very low level, and I believe modern liberal ideology, the kind of inverted values it promotes, is one of the biggest reasons. Those who can manipulate, deceive, exploit, or disregard the well-being of others are frequently the most successful in accumulating riches. Once this wealth has been secured, it is then transformed into social, political, and cultural power, allowing these same individuals to exert enormous influence over the very society they may have harmed in the process of becoming wealthy. Such a condition can be described as a form of vampirism. Those who rise to positions of power do so by drawing resources, labor, and energy from others, but this process is not limited to a handful of individuals. Society itself begins to operate according to the same principle. The people who exploit others are not anomalies. They are products of the value system that shaped them. As a result, they feed upon society, while society simultaneously feeds upon its own members. Eventually, both become locked in a destructive relationship. The soul of the individual and the soul of the state become entangled in a cycle of mutual consumption that ultimately damages everyone involved. The process feeds upon itself until it reaches a point of collapse. From this perspective, the oligarchic tendencies present within modern capitalism appear to be moving society in precisely this direction. The elevation of money above all other concerns already represents a profound inversion of values. It confuses the symbol with the reality that the symbol was created to represent. Money originated as a medium of exchange, a practical instrument that allows goods and services to be traded. People earn money because it grants access to things of genuine value, such as food, shelter, labor, and the necessities required for life. Yet over time, societies can begin treating money itself as the highest value. The representation becomes more important than what it represents. The symbol takes precedence over the reality behind it. In this sense, oligarchy develops when human beings stop using money as a means to secure values and instead begin sacrificing values in pursuit of money. The entire character of society changes because life itself is inseparable from value. Values shape human existence, give direction to action, and provide the foundation upon which societies are built. They are the source from which ways of living emerge. Consequently, every transformation of a society's value system also transforms its conditions of life. When money is valued more highly than labor, nourishment, shelter, community, or human flourishing, people gradually begin organizing their lives around accumulation rather than meaningful existence. The representation of value becomes more important than the realities it was meant to facilitate. This inversion creates the conditions for a deeply distorted social order. It helps explain why extraordinary concentrations of wealth can coexist alongside widespread deprivation. Some individuals may control numerous properties while countless others lack secure housing. Such outcomes become possible because the pursuit of money has displaced concern for the human realities that money was originally intended to serve. Social institutions can then become mechanisms through which human labor, time, energy, and resources are extracted for private benefit. The acquisition of gain becomes the overriding objective. As a result, people increasingly exploit one another, while the structures of society reinforce and magnify that exploitation. Society drains the vitality of individuals. Individuals drain the vitality of each other, and together they participate in a cycle of mutual depletion. What emerges is a continuous process of self-destruction in which both society and the people within it gradually undermine one another. The oligarchic dimension of modern capitalism often provides the pathway through which power is acquired. Yet once power has been obtained, it is frequently preserved through democratic mechanisms that can be equally problematic. Public opinion becomes a tool to be managed, shaped, and redirected. Political influence increasingly depends upon appealing to changing desires, emotions, and preferences rather than cultivating wisdom or pursuing the common good. People are often willing to support those who affirm their existing views or satisfy their immediate wants, regardless of the long-term consequences. Collective opinion becomes unstable, fragmented, and easily manipulated. In an age dominated by technology, mass communication, and digital networks, those who command attention possess an unprecedented ability to alter narratives and influence the beliefs of millions. Through this combination of oligarchic wealth and democratic persuasion, power becomes concentrated while maintaining the appearance of popular consent, allowing a small number of actors to shape the direction of entire societies. In a herd, people do not truly think for themselves. The group moves according to a shared opinion, yet each person has a slightly different attitude toward that opinion. One wants to reject it, another wants to improve it, and another accepts it only because no better answer is available. But if everyone relates to the collective view in a different way, then where does this opinion actually come from? Who first decided that this was the right direction, if no one fully owns it? In that sense, the herd follows a view that belongs to no one, and still everyone behaves as if it were their own. No individual is convinced on a deep level, and yet all continue along the same path because the others are doing it. Each person assumes there must be a reason behind the crowd's movement, as if the group had reached a clear conclusion. But once we look at the herd as what it really is, a collection of individuals rather than a single thinking subject, we see that no one actually believes this is the best way. Still, everyone follows, not because they have judged it to be good, but because the others are already doing the same. Even when people sense that something is wrong, they rarely resist, because the instinct to conform is stronger than personal will. The herd acts without a real reason, since each individual reason is weak and shallow. Everyone follows everyone else against their own judgment. Even when the herd moves toward harm, the person who sees the danger usually cannot break away, because the collective force is stronger than individual resistance. In this sense, the herd is mindless. That is why zombie films have become so popular. They show abandoned worlds and post-apocalyptic scenes in which human beings have become a dead, directionless mass. Those images reflect the shadow of the collective unconscious. Myths and stories often reveal what we need to recognize, because some instinct draws these scenes into imagination when they correspond to a hidden problem in human life. Yet this pull remains unconscious. Whether it is a zombie crowd or a human crowd, the herd is still mindless. Opinions are formed through this strange process of blending into the group. To me, this is one of the strangest things about human beings, and also one of the most dangerous. There is also a controlling democratic tendency in which people are pushed into equality by ruling powers. In order to make everyone equal, the only strategy seems to be forcing everyone to realize their potential in the same way. But this can only happen by obstructing the potential of those who have it more than others. In order to achieve justice, we turn to injustice, a pure inversion of values that I claim is the ground of the entire modern liberal democracy. But this post-war ideology, shaped so strongly by its desire to oppose what the Nazi regime represented, can eventually become a form of oppression that resembles the very thing it wants to defeat. Any natural difference is treated as suspicious, as if difference itself were a bad thing. The moment one thing differs from another, the assumption appears that one must be better and the other worse, and this is precisely what must be avoided. Yet in trying so hard to reject Nazi thinking, the modern liberal order can begin to mirror it in a new form. It is tied to technological progress, artificial development, media manipulation, and the shaping of public desires through systems that experiment on populations, normalize robotization, and slowly modify human nature itself. I would argue that there has never been a regime more similar in its structure to Hitler's Nazi Germany than modern Western liberal democracy at this moment. And I don't mean this because of Trump, or the far right or something. I actually believe that the modern left is even more Nazi-like than the right. But I'm not separating left and right. To me, they are the same thing in a bigger picture. At the end, I mean the entire modern liberal progressive ideology. In a disturbing sense, we may have gone beyond the Nazis. Modern liberal society has become more Hitler-like than Hitler himself. Hitler wanted to conquer the world, but the modern democratic system has already achieved a global reach. The political and cultural framework on which liberal democracy stands is already worldwide. It is becoming an artificial supercivilization, increasingly technologized, which sees itself as the highest authority and the source of goodness, equality, and progress. And if this process continues until society turns into a post-human, godlike machine that promises immortality, then the project will be complete. At that point, we will have built a kind of hell on earth. Society should instead be understood as an organic being. Just as each person is an individual soul, so too a society, a nation, a region, a continent, and ultimately the entire earth can each be seen as living wholes. Every one of these levels contains shared ideas, traditions, and values, and these common elements give the group its organic character. A nation is therefore a kind of soul, a living reality made up of individual souls who together form a shared field of meaning. Ideas themselves are powers, living realities, and living beings are themselves ideas embodied in form. Everything is structured by meaning, behavior, value, feeling, shape, size, and all other aspects of existence. Reality is not first and foremost made of empty matter or merely visible appearances. Those are only representations of the deeper reality, which is meaning. We need to learn to see through symbols and surface appearances in order to grasp what they truly signify. Truth itself can be compared to a material substance, like the material from which a building is made, except this material is meaning. Just as a house may be built from wood, stone, or iron, truth is made from meaning, and this is the real nature of reality. Meaning is in my view the essence of ideas, and this essence is embedded in every atom, every cell, and every material thing. This mental, meaningful substance is not just part of reality, it is reality itself. Now when we examine Plato and his philosophy in comparison to this modern anti-philosophy, we will examine Hegel, who was in my opinion one of the few last historical figures whom I would include among the true lovers of wisdom. I chose Hegel for this discussion alongside Plato because I believe that philosophy came on the crossroads in Hegelian thought that was split into factions that had great influence on later thinkers in all domains of human thought. Although Hegelianism is often divided into old and young Hegelian schools, many modern Hegelian philosophers hold views associated with both traditions. This blending of perspectives is primarily a modern phenomenon. During Hegel's life, especially referring to the time of his peak popularity, there was, broadly speaking, only Hegelianism, the philosophy Hegel wrote and people who followed it. I recognize that among Hegel's followers there were undoubtedly individuals with a variety of political inclinations, and some may have held views that would today be considered more left-leaning than others. However, I am speaking here in broad historical terms. It is a fact that during Hegel's lifetime there was no division between left and right Hegelianism, there was simply Hegelianism. The distinction emerged only after his death, when a number of thinkers began interpreting his philosophy in ways that aligned with revolutionary and political agendas of their own. In the process, those who remained closer to Hegel's religious convictions and more traditional conclusions were categorized as right-wing Hegelians. My concern is not whether some of these individuals personally accepted such a label. The more important point is that the classification itself originated from those who sought to distinguish their own interpretation from the earlier and more orthodox followers of Hegel. By labeling these thinkers as belonging to a right-wing faction, later interpreters created the impression that fidelity to Hegel's religious and traditional positions represented merely one political option among many, rather than a continuation of views that Hegel himself openly defended. I would point out the part after Hegel's death, meaning Hegel himself did not contribute to these labels or separation, and I believe this is crucial for what I am about to tell you and how I came to these conclusions. In my opinion, this process significantly altered the way his philosophy was understood and transmitted to later generations. Although the old Hegelians are often described as the right-wing branch of Hegelian philosophy, I do not believe this characterization accurately reflects their original intentions. Their primary objective was not to transform Hegel's thought into a conservative doctrine, but simply to follow Hegel as faithfully as possible. If their views later came to be associated with what we now call conservatism, this was not because they deliberately pushed Hegel in that direction. Rather, it was because many of the positions they defended were already present in Hegel's own writings. Left Hegelians, on the other hand, accepted specific parts of Hegel's philosophy that supported their ideology, while they dismissed others that didn't, and this left Hegelian current later became a strong influence on 20th-century progressive thought. A especially notable figure in this movement is Karl Marx. It is important to remember that ideological categories of what we today call left and right did not fully develop back then, but this period after Hegel's death, and this labeling of left and right division is probably one of the most significant influences on later development of right, but especially left camp, that increasingly associated Hegel's philosophy with progressive ideology as the time passed. For this reason, applying contemporary political labels to Hegel's earliest followers is misleading. These thinkers did not understand themselves as representatives of a right-wing movement. They regarded themselves simply as Hegelians, attempting to preserve and develop the philosophy of their teacher. From my perspective, the later division of Hegelianism into right and left factions served a particular interpretive function. Once new political movements emerged, especially those seeking to align Hegel with progressive or revolutionary causes, it became useful to present earlier Hegelians as belonging to an opposing camp. By doing so, Hegel himself could be positioned as a neutral figure whose philosophy remained open to competing interpretations. This created space for newer thinkers to claim Hegel for their own projects, while simultaneously distancing him from the conclusions reached by many of his earliest followers. Had the original followers simply remained known as Hegelians without additional labels, it would have been more difficult to separate Hegel from their interpretation of his work. And this is not just my opinion. Some historians of philosophy also claim that the right label applied to Hegel's early followers was artificially and even mockingly imposed by progressive leftists who sought to align Hegel's philosophy with their own progressive ideology. The creation of a distinct right Hegelian category allowed later interpreters to suggest that the conservative elements found in these readings originated primarily with the followers rather than with Hegel himself. In this way, the distinction between right and left Hegelianism became not only a historical classification but also a means of redefining the philosophical legacy of Hegel. Of course, once these divisions were firmly established, genuine debates emerged between thinkers who drew very different conclusions from Hegel's philosophy. At that stage, speaking of left and right Hegelian traditions became historically meaningful. My concern lies primarily with the origin of these categories. In the earliest period, there were not two opposing camps. There were simply followers of Hegel, many of whom had known him personally and sought to remain close to his actual teachings. Hegel's philosophy is in itself progressive in spirit, and I mean this literally, but I don't see this leftist interpretation as a fully faithful progression that Hegel advocated for. One could certainly argue that the right-wing Hegelians were actually the true progressives in Hegelian sense, while leftists just labeled them as conservative, but they also believed in rational progress of history, because this is Hegel's central claim. As soon as you are a Hegelian of any kind, you believe in progression of history. However, these so-called right-wing Hegelians, unlike the left-wing, preserved progress as Hegel saw it, not as they saw it personally like the left-wingers did. Hegel saw progress through institutions like family, religion, and the state. This is for Hegel true rational progress, and those early thinkers were faithful to this kind of progress. They were not conservatives. This is a fake label by leftists. Hegelian progress is not radical abolishing of institutions or some kind of dismissal of traditions. It is progress by carrying the traditions with us and progressing through these traditions, not by abolishing them but by developing them. This is the real Hegelianism. This issue becomes even more apparent when we consider Hegel's understanding of progress. Hegel did not conceive of progress primarily in political terms. For him, progress was not a matter of adopting particular slogans, supporting specific reforms, or identifying with one ideological camp against another. The true subject of progress was reality itself. History unfolds because reality unfolds, and political institutions participate in that process only insofar as they are expressions of a deeper rational development. Politics progresses because reality progresses. Human institutions change because they are embedded within a historical movement that cannot be separated from the development of spirit. For Hegel, the driving force behind history is not political activism, but the rational structure of existence itself. Reality possesses an inner logic, and this logic manifests through historical events, social institutions, religion, culture, and political life. Progress occurs not because people invent it, but because reality itself unfolds according to its own nature. This is why I believe it is misleading to describe Hegel as progressive in the modern political sense. Contemporary political discourse usually understands progress as support for particular ideological goals, social reforms, or cultural changes. Hegel's concept is far broader and far deeper than this. When he speaks of historical development, he is referring to the movement of reality as such, not to the victory of one political program over another. From a genuinely Hegelian perspective, even the most conservative worldview participates in progress simply because it exists within history and forms part of reality's development. Likewise, the most radical revolutionary movement also participates in this process. The distinction between conservative and progressive politics is secondary. What matters is that all historical phenomena are moments within the unfolding of spirit. No ideology can place itself outside this movement because nothing can stand outside reality itself. For this reason, I do not believe Hegel can be meaningfully identified with modern forms of progressive politics. Many contemporary political thinkers use the word progress in a way that is fundamentally different from Hegel's understanding. Hegel was not concerned with determining which political faction was more progressive than another. He was concerned with understanding the rational development of reality itself. In his view, everything that exists within history participates in this development, regardless of whether it presents itself as conservative, revolutionary, traditional, or reformist. The most reactionary political movement imaginable and the most radical revolutionary project imaginable are equally subject to the same historical process. Both are moments within the unfolding of reality. Hegel's philosophy is therefore not a theory of political progressivism, but a philosophy of historical and metaphysical development. He is not primarily speaking about competing ideologies. He is speaking about the movement of reality, and everything that belongs to reality necessarily takes part in that movement. I support progress in the sense that we should refine our traditions, removing errors, distortions, and misunderstandings while preserving what is valuable within them. This is the central theme of this discussion. I do not believe that genuine progress consists of abandoning inherited traditions and replacing them entirely with new ones. Traditions are not external objects that can simply be discarded at will. They are the very framework within which our ideas, values, and ways of understanding the world emerge. For this reason, I often argue that Plato's philosophy is not merely one philosophical system among many others. As one of the foundational structures of Western thought, it functions more as the intellectual space within which much of Western philosophy takes place. It provides a framework that continues to shape the development of ideas long after Plato himself. The rise of Christianity after the Hellenistic period should therefore not be understood as a complete rejection of what came before. Rather, Christianity continued and transformed many of the traditions it inherited. In many respects, Christianity can be viewed as a development of themes already present within Platonism. Just as Plato drew upon thinkers such as Pythagoras, Parmenides, and Heraclitus, Christianity inherited elements not only from Plato but also from the broader traditions that influenced him, and those that came after him for that matter, like for example philosophy of Aristotle and Neoplatonism. Civilizations develop through the gradual transformation and reinterpretation of ideas. They do not emerge by erasing their predecessors, because such a process would be impossible. Every new stage of cultural development carries traces of what came before it. Many Christians view Christianity as standing in direct opposition to pagan traditions, yet this perspective overlooks the historical and philosophical continuity that exists between them. If Christianity is examined from the level of archetypes and ideas, rather than through superficial opposition, it becomes clear that it incorporates many of the traditions from which it emerged. Christianity represents a synthesis of Jewish and Hellenistic thought, rather than a total rejection of either. Consequently, these earlier traditions should not be treated as enemies, but as components of the larger intellectual and spiritual inheritance that Christianity itself embodies. If pagan and Jewish traditions were completely removed from history, Christianity would disappear with them, because it was formed through their interaction. We shouldn't pretend these traditions are exactly the same, but we should see them as parts of a greater whole that emerged through the metamorphosis of shared meaning. To claim that Christianity stands entirely opposed to ancient Greek religion is therefore similar to claiming that a part of oneself is an enemy. It would be like treating one's own hand or leg as something foreign that must be removed. Although Western civilization eventually came to emphasize the idea of a single supreme source of reality, rather than a plurality of gods, the symbolic significance of the ancient gods has not vanished. The gods of Greece and Rome continue to exist as archetypal patterns and enduring symbols within the collective imagination of the West. They remain present as expressions of certain ideas, values, and modes of experience that continue to influence culture. As a Christian, I do not see this as something that must be denied. Rather than fighting against reality, I believe it is important to recognize it as it is. Progress should consist in understanding our civilization honestly and working to purify those elements that create unnecessary conflict or fragmentation within it. The traditions that shaped our civilization are not separate from us. They are the environment within which our lives, thoughts, and identities have developed. In a profound sense, these ideas are reality that we inhabit. Physical reality follows patterns that first exist on the level of meaning and ideas. Eternal truths express themselves through change, flowing into the world through the activity of the divine intellect and the world's soul, in which every individual participates. The structures of society, culture, and civilization are therefore outward expressions of deeper archetypal realities. The same forces that animated ancient Hellenistic culture continue to live within us today. Their traditions, myths, religions, customs, architecture, and ways of understanding the world have not disappeared. They have been transformed and incorporated into the living soul of Western civilization. Western civilization itself can be understood as a symbol that unites countless generations, cultures, and traditions into a continuous process of intellectual and spiritual development. What exists today is the result of a long metamorphosis of meanings stretching across centuries. Because of this, traditions cannot simply be abandoned without consequences. To reject them entirely would be, in a sense, to reject part of our own soul. One of the dangers of modernity is its tendency to weaken this connection by encouraging people to view their traditions with hostility or contempt. This struggle is not new. Throughout history there have always been demonic forces that seek to overturn established orders and redirect civilizations toward different ends. Yet at present these disruptive influences appear especially powerful. Their effect has become so pervasive that reversing their course may prove extremely difficult. Within the symbolic framework discussed here, this is the work of the devil, to lead humanity towards self-destruction by persuading people to imitate disorder and rebellion. At times it seems as though this project is succeeding. If such demonic forces were ever to achieve complete dominance, their influence would eventually require purification. This is one way to understand the symbolism of apocalypse and judgment. Many people associate destruction exclusively with evil, but within this perspective destruction can also serve as a means of removing evil. In order to grant genuine freedom and love to creation, God must permit the possibility of evil. This is part of what makes divine goodness meaningful. Goodness is not established by preventing all evil from occurring, but by allowing freedom to exist even when that freedom can be misused. Love that excludes freedom would not be true love, yet allowing evil indefinitely would also be contrary to goodness. Therefore, after permitting evil for the sake of freedom and love, God ultimately confronts and removes it for the sake of restoration. In this view, the existence of evil is not evidence against divine goodness, but a necessary condition for genuine freedom. Perfect love can only exist where freedom is complete, and complete freedom includes the possibility of choosing wrongly. Evil therefore plays a role within the larger order of reality. God is not good because he is either good or evil. God is good because even evil is part of this goodness. In fact, if there was no evil, God wouldn't be perfectly good nor loving. Evil is an essential part of this perfection. Nevertheless, the nature of evil is such that it seeks to dominate and replace the good rather than coexist with it. When evil attempts to establish itself as the ultimate principle, it must be opposed. At that point, divine wisdom and love require purification. The destruction associated with apocalypse is therefore not understood as an act of hatred, but as a necessary act of restoration, through which creation is cleansed of what seeks to corrupt and dominate it. In this way, judgment itself becomes an expression of goodness directed toward the preservation of truth, freedom, and love. And this is why I chose Hegel for this video, because I decided to criticize the superficiality of this new kind of thinkers who are increasingly trying to dismantle any kind of value system, the kind that inverts truth, the kind that has no shame in trying to mislead, to deceive in order to preserve their radical religion of destruction and manipulation. This is the kind of thought, I think, that will lead to increasingly harder times and greater consequences, because, I will argue, this kind of thinking leads into destruction and death. It is in essence a struggle against reality and against our own well-being. To invert values, to struggle against truth, means to increasingly support ideas that bring harm to life and to society. Hegel's philosophy is an intersection where this ideology of death took root. But this is not Hegel's fault, as I said. While Hegel was alive, no one called those who followed him right-wing nor left-wing. It is only after he died where manipulation started. I don't agree on everything with Hegel, and I will explore some disagreements and even criticize his views, but that's exactly the point. I will not pretend that a philosopher believed something that he did not in order to distort and claim that he supported everything I believe. And this is exactly what many people did after his death. I believe this is wrong. I will not criticize progress. It is clear to me that progress is necessary. Reality and history are simply of such nature that movement is inevitable. I will criticize the kind of modernist liberal form of progress, the political religion, liberal democratic ideology itself, which is most clearly expressed through this new, mostly but not specifically leftist form of neoliberalism, which in my view is not truly a progress. If progress is harmful, if it leads into filth and debauchery, if society is becoming increasingly ugly in every respect, I cannot agree to call this progress. This is a regress. Progress is towards something good. It can't be ugly. This is exactly what this left-wing Hegelian movement represents in my view. These are the first steps towards ugliness and increasing debauchery within society by constructing a goal of inversion of values, dismantling of traditions and separating people from the very soul of their own societies. I would argue this is impossible, and this is exactly why attempting to do it can only lead to harm. I see the later labeling process as an example of a broader tendency within modern intellectual culture, an emphasis on categories, terminology, and symbolic classifications that often takes precedence over the substance of what people actually believed. Instead of beginning with the philosophical content itself, attention is frequently directed toward labels that simplify, categorize, and reorganize ideas according to contemporary concerns. The result is that historical thinkers are increasingly interpreted through frameworks that originated long after their deaths. Yet even when language is used in ways that distort reality, it still serves a purpose and therefore possesses meaning. Misrepresentation is itself a meaningful act. In this case, the reclassification of Hegel and his followers can be understood as creating conceptual space for alternative interpretations of his philosophy. Whether intentional or not, the effect is to make Hegel appear more compatible with positions that differ substantially from many of his own commitments. What emerges is a broader process of inversion. The representation begins to overshadow what is represented. Labels become more important than the realities they describe. linguistic constructions take precedence over philosophical substance. Instead of asking what Hegel believed and why he believed it, the discussion increasingly revolves around symbolic categories that can be manipulated and rearranged according to present ideological needs. In my view, this tendency reflects a deeper philosophical problem. When reality is no longer understood as possessing an objective rational structure, interpretation becomes detached from any stable foundation. Everything appears open to reconstruction, revision, and redefinition. Meaning is treated as something imposed by language, rather than something discovered within reality itself. As a consequence, philosophical systems can be reshaped almost indefinitely, regardless of their original context or intention. However, words and symbols cannot be understood in isolation from the realities to which they refer. The crucial question is not merely how concepts are described, but what effects particular interpretations produce in practice. Ideas reveal themselves through their consequences. To understand an intellectual movement, we must examine not only its language, but also the form of life it encourages and the social realities it creates. From this perspective, the reinterpretation of Hegel is not simply a dispute about philosophy. It becomes part of a larger transformation of cultural values. When substance is subordinated to appearance, when symbolic constructions become detached from deeper meaning, a process of inversion begins to affect the broader civilization as well. What was once regarded as foundational becomes secondary, while what was once secondary is elevated to a position of authority. I see this tendency as characteristic of a worldview that denies objective meaning and replaces it with relativistic constructions rooted primarily in material or ideological concerns. Such a worldview gradually reorganizes the entire hierarchy of values upon which a civilization rests. In doing so, it risks creating a social order increasingly disconnected from the principles that originally sustained it. The result is a system that ultimately turns against its own foundations, consuming the very structures that made its existence possible and, in the end, undermining itself along with those who continue to support it. It is only under these conditions that I see the possibility where Hegel's philosophy can be interpreted through these modern political labels like left and right. I specifically have a problem with the label left, even though I believe right, in a modern sense, is also a wrong term to characterize Hegel, but it is this term that Hegel was a leftist. This is where his philosophy reaches new levels of distortion. To be clear, I am not opposed to real and honest interpretation. I believe the entire philosophy is a dialogue between ideas. I am opposed to deception and to inversion of ideas. Constructing a new philosophy by being inspired by some thinkers is not the same as constructing a new philosophy, and after that claiming that thinker by whom we were inspired believed the same. There are many people who want to preserve the ideas of people from the past as they are, but there are also an increasing number of people who want to distort, to completely rewrite history. This is where I see the danger. I even read and appreciate a number of thinkers who identify themselves as Hegelians, even though I believe their views differ fundamentally from Hegel's own position. My point is only that distinctions should be made between thinkers who were inspired by Hegel, thinkers who reworked his philosophy and incorporated it into their own systems, and Hegel himself, along with those who seek to follow closely what he actually wrote. In this way we can understand the meaning of each idea clearly. If we can't do this, we are stuck on the surface of language without meaning, where misinterpretations and deceptions become inevitable. This kind of philosophy is not philosophy. It is a new modern religion of progressive liberal ideology of right and left. But let's briefly describe the differences between this deceptively imposed distinction between right and left Hegelians as conceptualized by modern progressive religious priesthood of academia. Old Hegelians are often associated with a traditional interpretation of Hegel, one that takes into account the entirety of his philosophical system and gives significant importance to Hegelian metaphysics as developed in the science of logic, which Hegel himself regarded as the foundation of his philosophy. Young Hegelians, by contrast, are often associated with later, more progressive reinterpretations of Hegel that tend to dismiss or minimize his metaphysics, and instead focus primarily on the historical and particular aspects of his thought. In many cases, these interpretations transform Hegel's philosophy into a form of historicism, relativism, or even materialism that leaves little room for God, religion, or Hegel's broader philosophical system known as absolute idealism. This is a significant departure from Hegel's own position. Idealism is fundamentally opposed to materialism, and Hegel never described himself as a materialist. For this reason, the attempt to interpret Hegel through a purely materialist framework often appears totally absurd to me. There are many progressive and materialist thinkers who were inspired by Hegel, and I read some of them with great interest and respect. However, if they are materialists, they are not truly followers of Hegel in the strict sense, because Hegel himself was not a materialist. This materialist interpretation, or people who increasingly started understanding Hegel through materialism, largely came from later Marxist interpretations. And even though I disagree with Marx in some of the most essential aspects, I don't even have the biggest problem with Marx and those who truly follow what he wrote. Because these people at least have a rational philosophy and clear ideas to which they stick. Their ideas have fixed meaning connected to reality. So as strange as this sounds, they at least believe in reality, and you can understand what they are saying when they say it. Their thoughts have a rational goal. I even think that Marx had some good points in his theory of class struggle, but I believe that his philosophy is completely undeveloped. I would say that his materialism is precisely a kind of worldview that would lead people to behave in a way that supports the rationality of class struggle, instead of critique. And I also believe that his rejection of metaphysics is exactly what at the end results in a belief that reality is not real, and is instead arbitrary and relative. In my view, materialism rejects the reality of moral facts. There is simply no place for true fixed moral facts. If everything is material reality, morality itself becomes its product, meaning morality is what we decide. Marx himself believed that morality is nothing but a feature of human behavior. Yes, he tried to ground it in some sense in a broader rational order of society, but regardless, morality is not something that we discover, it is something that we produce as a consequence of social relations. Here, in Marx, we see first steps towards relativization of truths that were before him seen as fixed facts grounded in divine order, and which were understood in context of religion. Since Marx rejected religion, he also had to reject the concrete realness of morality. If people believe in purely material reality, I do not see what stops people in having their most rational goal as a wish to rule over others and to orient themselves toward material gain. And if they believe that reality is entirely material, they start believing that the society we created is the ultimate reality and not something that reflects it. In this way, people start increasingly believing that reality is whatever we decide it to be. It is not entirely clear that Marx believed this exactly. He always tried to impose rationality from the perspective of purely material relations, though I would say this is absurd. He at least had a sense that his philosophy needs some kind of rational structure that he grounded in materialism. And because I believe this is impossible, because materialism is insufficient to clearly explain and ground all aspects of reality in concrete facts, like morality for example, this philosophy of Marx starts providing a ground for relativized abstract view of everything. This is precisely by far the greatest problem with materialism and the source of all problems that I discuss in this video. In my personal opinion, Marx's philosophy supports exactly the things he criticizes the most: class disparity and belief in abstraction instead of concreteness of reality. But even though I believe Marx is wrong, I am more opposed to this new form of neo-Marxist postmodern neoliberalism where everything is arbitrary and nothing has any meaning, nothing is clear, everything can be distorted as we wish. So even if Marx did not believe this, in materialistic worldview, the reality itself inevitably ends up as an ever-changing symbolic structure of society. If material reality is the entire reality, society itself becomes the ultimate reality instead of symbol for something deeper. In this way, we can decide what is good and what is bad. We can overturn the nature of reality, and by deciding that destructive acts are actually beneficial, we can start doing all the destructive acts for our benefit. This is a joke. I know no one actually believes this, but these philosophies lead people to behave as if this is exactly what they believe. Everything is a context. Everything is unfixed personal interpretation, and therefore nothing is real. And even though nothing is real, it is still we who decide what is real. Our interpretations of reality are reality, but at the same time reality does not exist. This is what you end up believing when your entire reality becomes pure materialism, where reality is nothing but conditions that humans impose on it. But this is not correct. Society itself, and everything within it, is in its essence a symbol for the deeper reality of meaning or the realm of ideas that sustain it. You have today modern liberals who believe that we can't escape the context or symbolic structure, and this is precisely the point. We must be able to do it, because if we are not able to escape the symbolic structure, nothing would be real, there would be nothing to symbolize. And even if there is something behind the symbols, we need to be able to escape the symbolic structure in order to construct it. Our construction of symbolic structures begins at raw material of truth. However you put it, we must have some concrete structure of reality, and material reality is an ever-changing structure, and nothing is fixed. So material reality is not this structure. I believe what is concrete are ideas. Hegel's idealism, contrary to popular opinion, does not allow this kind of relativistic worldview, because he believed in reality where meaningful distinctions can be made according to fixed and rational rules grounded in metaphysics, meaning in the very nature of realness itself. So in order for something to be real, it must be subjected to these fixed rules. Yet even Marx himself acknowledged that he had inverted Hegel's philosophy. In other words, Marx openly claimed that his own position stood in a fundamental sense opposite to Hegel's. For this reason, I do not think one can consistently be both a Marxist and a Hegelian. Marxism is grounded in materialism, whereas Hegel's philosophy is grounded in idealism. These are not merely different viewpoints. They are opposing metaphysical foundations. If one was searching for the position furthest removed from materialism, one would arrive at idealism. The two stand in direct opposition. Those who have followed my channel will know that I myself embraced an idealist metaphysics. I tend to divide philosophy into two broadly defined but opposing camps. On one side are philosophies that affirm the soul and the living dimension of reality, philosophies in which existence is imbued with meaning, spirit, and living energy. On the other side are philosophies that regard life as a byproduct, an accident, or merely the result of material processes. These latter views often deny the soul, reject metaphysical thinking, though I would argue that such a rejection is itself impossible, and promote a purely mechanical conception of reality, one lacking genuine life, will, or spiritual depth. My own outlook is influenced primarily by ancient Greek Pythagorean and Platonic thought, as well as by Christianity. I believe that the Platonic affirmation of the soul continued through Christianity during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, especially through its mystical currents and through traditions that would today often be described as esoteric or occult. Within these traditions there was certainly a mixture of wisdom and error, but I believe something essential was preserved through them, a living spiritual vision of reality that remained present throughout European history. Pythagorean and Platonic ideas spread through many philosophical and religious traditions, including Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Christianity, and Kabbalah. With the exception of Christianity, many of these traditions survived primarily through underground mystical currents during the medieval period. Christianity, however, became both the dominant public religion and a source of numerous esoteric traditions. It existed in many forms and influenced a wide variety of religious movements, mystical schools, and secret societies throughout history. It also spread across the world in numerous denominations, ranging from highly literal and fundamentalist interpretations of the Bible to deeply mystical and symbolic approaches that understood Scripture primarily through allegory and spiritual insight. It is well known that all of the major German idealist thinkers, Hegel included, were influenced to a greater or lesser degree by these kinds of spiritual, religious, and philosophical traditions. I believe that all of these traditions carry within them a Platonic core, a vision of reality in which soul, meaning, and spirit occupy a central place. Through Christianity in particular, this core was transmitted into later European thought, eventually reaching one of its highest philosophical expressions in German idealism. In my view, German idealism represents the last great mainstream philosophical movement that preserved a vision of reality grounded in life, meaning, and spirit rather than in purely mechanical processes and material substances. It was perhaps the final major philosophical tradition that was taken seriously within the intellectual mainstream, while still standing firmly opposed to the reduction of reality to matter alone. Yet over time, even this tradition came to be distorted and misunderstood. Today, many of these philosophers are dismissed as irrational thinkers who believed in magic, superstition, or supernatural fantasies. Their metaphysical ideas are often treated as relics of a less enlightened age, unworthy of serious consideration. In much the same way that philosophy was increasingly reshaped by materialist assumptions, Christianity itself also underwent profound transformations. I believe that over time the mystical dimension of Christianity was gradually weakened and replaced by increasingly materialistic interpretations, often accompanied by highly literal readings of biblical symbolism. The same thing that happened to our understanding of reality at the same time happened to our philosophy, religion, and everything else. This is because all these constructions in the realm of language, like religion, science, philosophy, all of them are in themselves completely merged with our understanding of reality. They reflect our views of reality. We see reality through the construction of these meaningful structures because reality itself is one such meaningful structure in itself. This is why, as our understanding of reality became more superficial, religion at the same time became increasingly absurd and superficial, seen through purely materialistic, relativistic language where symbols do not have deeper meaning. They are just words, and these words do not point at some deeper reality. They themselves are considered to be reality of their own. Nothing is connected to anything. Everything is in fragments, and words and reality are completely disconnected. And since words are disconnected from reality, that which is written in allegorical or metaphorical manner is at the same time seen as something that is not real. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of ideas and language. All texts, no matter their nature, contain some element of truth, because they contain ideas and various meaningful expressions that can be applied or connected to reality, because reality itself is not made from material, it is made from living ideas. With materialism, this living ideal reality does not exist, and when reality was increasingly understood in this way, Bible began to be interpreted literally, because if it's not interpreted in such way, it is not true. One could even argue that the life-affirming and spiritually meaningful dimension of Christianity was, in some sense, pushed out of the mainstream and forced to survive in the background. This undoubtedly exposed it to various distortions and excesses, which is one reason many people today are hesitant to embrace mystical or allegorical interpretations of Christianity. Such interpretations are often associated with fringe beliefs or with ideas that many consider irrational. Nevertheless, despite all these difficulties, the living core of Christianity survived. It remains present even today, though often buried beneath layers of historical debris. My own goal is to promote this life-affirming branch of thought, a vision of reality in which every aspect of existence is imbued with meaning and life. Since we ourselves are living beings, I do not believe that we inhabit a reality in which life emerges merely as an accident. Rather, I believe that life is fundamental to reality itself. Life is not a product of reality. Life is reality. German idealism is one of the last great movements in Western thought that preserves this anti-materialist and life-affirming vision. I have great reverence for all of the major German idealists, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and others. Although I may disagree with them on particular issues, I deeply admire all of them because I believe they carried the soul of Western thought into modernity. Had it not been for the German idealists, I suspect that this entire philosophical tradition, where some kind of living soul is an essential part of reality, might have been swallowed by mechanical materialism long ago. For this reason, it troubles me when idealist thinkers are interpreted through this relativistic materialistic framework. Hegel is especially subjected to this kind of treatment, as his philosophy is often interpreted as if it supports some kind of materialist-leaning conception of reality, and sometimes people outright claim that he was a materialist. I am not claiming this is a dominant view of Hegel. Most people understand that this claim is absurd, but the fact that such claims are even made is what seems to me very strange, at minimum. Even those who understand that idealism is incompatible with materialism often seem to lack a clear understanding of the weight this holds, and what this incompatibility truly implies. Hegel developed his distinctive dialectical understanding of reality and history precisely because he was an idealist. His philosophy presupposes a living spiritual principle that animates reality itself. Without this foundation, much of his system ceases to make sense. When I encounter the phrase dialectical materialism, I struggle to understand what it is intended to mean. To me, dialectic presupposes life, development, and self-movement. It emerges through thought and spirit. Materialism, by contrast, describes reality in mechanical terms. If reality is fundamentally material and devoid of spirit, then the dialectical movement that Hegel describes seems not only difficult to account for, but impossible. This is not only what I think. I am almost 100% certain that Hegel himself would say this. If you do not understand this, I think it is logical to conclude that you do not understand why Hegel called himself an idealist, why he chose to use this name for his philosophical system. From my perspective, Hegel's conception of history is dialectical because reality itself is alive. Spirit is not merely one aspect of reality. It is the living principle through which reality unfolds. Dialectic is therefore an expression of life and thought. To remove spirit from the equation while retaining the dialectic is a contradiction in terms. For this reason, I find the notion of a purely material dialectic nonsensical. In my understanding, dialectic belongs to the realm of living spirit, and it is only there that it becomes fully intelligible. Idealism does not claim that the material world is unreal. Rather, it holds that material reality itself is grounded in, shaped by, or derived from ideas. Matter is the most external and superficial layer of reality, and when it is entirely divorced from meaning, purpose, or intelligibility, it dissolves into pure chaos, a kind of nothingness. Even the apparent solidity of material objects depends upon form and meaning. Hardness itself is not merely a brute fact, but an expression of an underlying, intelligible structure. Matter can therefore be understood as the outer shell of reality, while meaning or idea is what gives that shell its form and coherence. Materialism, by contrast, grants primary importance to this outer shell while neglecting or denying the deeper dimension of meaning. Yet even matter, from an idealist perspective, remains meaningful. Many materialists reject this claim and regard talk of meaning or idea within matter as irrational or unnecessary, but Hegel, however, did not. This is precisely why attempts to reinterpret Hegel as a materialist depart from the central purpose of his philosophy. Hegel was not primarily concerned with investigating the universe as a collection of physical objects. He was concerned with spirit, life, and the self-unfolding of consciousness. Spirit stands at the center of his entire philosophical project. If one rejects spirit in the sense that Hegel understood it, it becomes impossible to claim fidelity to his philosophy, since his system was constructed upon the conviction that reality is permeated by spirit. It is mistaken to imagine that Hegel developed dialectics separately from his belief in God. For Hegel, dialectic and the divine are inseparable. The structure of reality itself is dialectical because reality is the expression of spirit. To suggest that Hegel was unknowingly a materialist and that later thinkers understand his philosophy better than he did himself seems a little bit ridiculous. Such a position implies that Hegel fundamentally misunderstood the very principles upon which he built his system. While anyone is free to hold that view, I find it difficult to accept. It appears to rest on the assumption that contemporary interpreters can simply discard the metaphysical foundations of a philosopher's thought while still claiming to preserve its essence. Hegel's philosophy can also be understood as profoundly mystical once the relationship between idealism and mysticism is properly grasped. Mysticism is often described as union with God, the possibility of directly experiencing divine reality in the present moment. This does not mean that God exists only beyond the world. Although God is transcendent as the source of all reality, the divine is simultaneously present throughout existence. Mystical experience consists in becoming directly aware of this presence. Hegel's concept of absolute knowing is, in this sense, one of the most mystical ideas in the history of philosophy. It points toward the realization that the individual is not separate from the whole of reality, but participates in it. In a certain sense, it is the recognition of unity with the divine ground of existence. Each individual is, at the same time, the entire reality. My conviction that Hegel's philosophy is mystical arises from the simple fact that he was an idealist. In my view, idealism and mysticism are deeply connected, and probably even inseparable. All idealist philosophers, in one form or another, can be regarded as mystics because they affirm that spirit, mind, or a divine principle permeates reality. Idealism maintains that reality is fundamentally grounded in ideas, and ideas are inseparable from mind or consciousness. This implies that reality is animated by a living spiritual dimension in which we ourselves participate. Such participation is already a form of union with the divine, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. Mystical realization occurs when that unity becomes conscious. This does not require belief in some separate supernatural realm existing beyond nature. Rather, it suggests that nature itself possesses a spiritual or sacred dimension. Many people will undoubtedly reject the claim that idealism and mysticism are essentially the same. I am aware that this is not a standard position within the history of philosophy. Nevertheless, it seems to me that if mysticism is understood as direct awareness of God or of unity with the divine, and if idealism is understood in its metaphysical sense as the view that reality is grounded in mind, spirit, or ideas, then every form of idealism contains a mystical possibility at its core. Indeed, this conclusion appears almost unavoidable. If reality is infused with meaning, and if spirit is genuinely present within nature, then mystical experience becomes not only possible but philosophically intelligible. The moment one affirms that some form of living spirit permeates reality, one has already entered territory traditionally associated with mysticism. Idealism cannot entirely escape this implication. Consider some of the major idealist thinkers: Schelling, Schopenhauer, Bishop George Berkeley, Leibniz, Plato, and the Neoplatonists. Each, in different ways, affirmed a reality that transcends mere material existence. Likewise, most religious traditions throughout history have embraced metaphysical principles that are fundamentally idealist. They generally describe reality as originating from a divine intelligence, consciousness, or spiritual source. This is, at least in broad terms, an idealist understanding of existence. For this reason, idealism can be viewed as inherently connected to religious metaphysics. One could even argue that the major religions of the world presuppose some form of idealism. Their teachings typically depend upon the idea that reality is grounded in a spiritual principle rather than in matter alone. If reality is not fundamentally idealist, many religious doctrines become difficult to justify. If reality is idealist, however, they acquire a coherent metaphysical foundation. This is why I believe that a proper understanding of idealism reveals its intimate connection to religion, mysticism, and metaphysics as a whole. If one fails to see that connection, then I suspect there may be a misunderstanding not only of idealism itself, but also of the role that metaphysics plays within philosophy. I mean this quite seriously. From this perspective, the modern worldview, grounded primarily in materialism, gives rise to a particular political order that finds its highest expression in contemporary liberal democracy. Liberalism, moral relativism, the rejection of metaphysics, and the denial of objective moral truths together form what I regard as an ideology fundamentally opposed to life. If reality is truly permeated by spirit, meaning, and intrinsic value, then the belief that reality is nothing more than a lifeless collection of material processes represents a profound misunderstanding of existence itself. When our understanding of reality stands in opposition to the nature of life, we inevitably create social systems and ideologies that reflect this error. For this reason, I believe that modern liberal democracy increasingly undermines many of the essential qualities that define human existence. I do not identify with either the political left or the political right because my criticism extends beyond particular parties or movements and toward the democratic framework itself. In my view, liberal democracy contains within itself the source of many of its own failures. The great achievements of Western civilization, its cultural, intellectual, artistic, and scientific foundations, were largely established before the rise of modern liberal democratic systems. Liberal democracy inherited the benefits of these earlier developments, yet rather than accelerating human flourishing, it has often slowed it and weakened many of the institutions and values upon which civilization depends. I am inclined to think that had a different political order emerged during the same historical period, progress in many areas of human life could have been even greater. A common belief is that democracy is uniquely capable of preserving freedom. I do not share this assumption. I am speaking about political freedom or liberty here. This is not the same as the idea of the freedom, or freedom that is embodied in each individual soul. This kind of freedom of the spirit is something much more fundamental, and it can't be diminished by political restrictions. Political systems are just a symbolic structure that tries to imitate or align as much as possible with this original freedom that can be found in the soul. Even in the most restricted political system, the freedom of the soul is absolute, but in a symbolic structure of society, we have some kind of system that would allow these absolutely free souls to live as a cohesive unity. If every single person on earth realized perfect goodness, we could have a society that is in complete alignment with absolute freedom of the soul. But since there is ignorance and evil in each soul, in order for civilization to function, this evil tendencies must be discouraged. In this way, each society or civilization needs some kind of rules in order to preserve the balance of social order. The question is therefore not whether limits exist, but what form they take. In many cases, I believe democracy offers more the appearance of freedom than freedom itself. The modern democratic system depends heavily upon this perception. If people cease to believe that they were exceptionally free under such a system, one of its central foundations would disappear. They might even begin to question whether the freedom they assumed existed had ever truly been present. Consequently, I regard contemporary liberal democracy as a form of soft tyranny, one in which individuals believe themselves to be free while remaining subject to extensive forms of control. Economic structures, educational institutions, legal systems, media environments, and numerous other aspects of society exert a degree of influence that many people fail to recognize. The actual level of freedom within a society, I would argue, depends less upon its formal political institutions than upon the level of consciousness possessed by its citizens. Political systems are ultimately shaped by human consciousness, not the other way around. From this perspective, the cultural conditions that existed when liberal democracy emerged could have supported alternative systems capable of providing equal or even greater protections for individual liberty. Because liberal democracy rests upon certain collective assumptions and illusions, it creates opportunities for ambitious and power-seeking individuals to accumulate influence while remaining largely invisible to the public. Today, with increasing technological integration and surveillance, this process may have advanced so far that many people scarcely notice it. In this respect, I find the warnings of Plato regarding democracy remarkably relevant. His argument that democracy can gradually transform into tyranny appears, in my opinion, to have enduring significance. I also believe that the apparent conflict between the political left and the political right often obscures a deeper unity. Despite their differences, both sides frequently operate within the same broader framework, a materialist, technological, and increasingly globalized worldview. From a higher perspective, their disagreements concern methods rather than ultimate direction. Both participate in a process that leads toward greater centralization, greater dependence upon technological systems, and greater separation from what is natural and fundamentally human. The distinctions between competing political movements therefore seem less important than they first appear. They represent different paths toward a similar destination, a social order in which control becomes so pervasive that it is no longer recognized as control. Totalitarianism, under such conditions, could present itself as freedom. This does not necessarily require the abolition of nations or the creation of a single world state, as some popular theories suggest. Nations may remain formally independent while becoming increasingly integrated into larger structures that coordinate policy, economics, and governance across national boundaries. Institutions such as international alliances and supranational organizations illustrate this tendency. In my own country, for example, membership in larger political structures has often involved the implementation of rules and policies that many citizens never directly approved. This raises difficult questions about the meaning of democratic participation and political sovereignty. The same concerns extend to the global financial system. Modern monetary systems are increasingly centralized, and national economies are deeply interconnected through banking institutions and debt structures. An especially troubling feature of this arrangement is that money is largely created through debt. As a result, governments around the world find themselves carrying ever-expanding levels of debt with no clear endpoint in sight. The fact that this debt continues to grow indefinitely suggests to me that there may be deeper structural problems within the foundations of the contemporary global order. Almost all countries in the world are in an ever-growing debt, and no one asks how is this even possible. No one asks why nations are not allowed to regulate money properly, why this regulation belongs to this higher global power that even determines the rules under which the wealth of all nations is controlled. The very fact that society increasingly divides people into two opposing political categories is, in my view, evidence of a deeper intellectual and cultural problem. Nearly every idea, belief, or action is now interpreted through the lens of left and right. Rather than encouraging genuine thought, this framework often determines in advance what individuals are expected to believe. Meaningful discussion becomes increasingly difficult because many people already possess their conclusions before any conversation begins. Their political identity dictates their position. I reject this way of thinking entirely. To me, this is not genuine thought but conformity disguised as opinion. When I examine modern democracy and the division between left and right, I do not simply see competing political factions, I see what are essentially two political religions. Their followers are often emotionally invested in their beliefs to such an extent that politics takes on a religious character. These convictions become part of personal identity, and because of this emotional attachment, political leaders gain the ability to shape, direct, and manipulate their supporters in ways that would otherwise be impossible. I do not consider the religious aspect of politics to be unusual. On the contrary, I believe religion is rooted in the very structure of human consciousness. Whatever occupies the highest place in a person's hierarchy of values functions as their religion. Religion is not merely a set of doctrines that one chooses to accept or reject. It is the framework of meaning through which reality is interpreted. Human beings cannot escape this structure because meaning itself is unavoidable. In the modern world, where democratic systems encourage citizens to participate in political life, or at least encourage them to believe they do, religion increasingly takes the form of political ideology. On the political right, for example, there is often a strong association with Christianity and the Bible. Yet I would argue that in many cases Christianity serves less as the ultimate goal and more as a symbolic resource incorporated into a broader political worldview. What is frequently presented as religion appears to me more like a political identity clothed in religious language. This is why governments and political movements can publicly celebrate Christian symbols while simultaneously supporting policies that seem difficult to reconcile with Christian principles. One can praise sacred texts while contributing to endless geopolitical conflicts and accelerating the development of a technological civilization increasingly detached from human values. Technology, in particular, has become one of the dominant forces shaping modern life. Participation in contemporary society increasingly requires dependence upon digital systems. Every action leaves behind data, and that data becomes a resource feeding vast technological and economic structures. Large corporations accumulate unprecedented influence over communication, information, and public perception. In this environment, technology does not merely serve humanity. It increasingly shapes the conditions under which people think, communicate, and understand the world. Individuals are often exposed primarily to what technological systems place before them, and this alone suggests how deeply human consciousness has become intertwined with digital mechanisms. The political left frequently criticizes capitalism and concentrations of economic power, yet I believe it often overlooks the deeper philosophical assumptions that contribute to those very outcomes. A worldview grounded entirely in materialism, stripped of intrinsic meaning and spiritual significance, naturally encourages people to pursue material success as the highest goal. If reality contains nothing beyond matter, power, and survival, then the pursuit of wealth and advantage appears entirely rational. In this sense, I see a tension within many forms of left-wing thought. Thinkers such as Karl Marx criticized capitalism, yet the broader materialist assumptions underlying much modern political thought can themselves encourage the very attitudes that capitalism exploits. If people are expected to sacrifice for others, support their communities, or pursue the common good, these values must be grounded in a deeper understanding of reality. Community must possess intrinsic significance. Life itself must be understood as something greater than material accumulation. Spirit, goodness, and meaning cannot merely be human inventions. They must correspond to something real within the structure of existence. The purpose of life, from this perspective, is not the pursuit of private gain, but the realization of a higher good that possesses genuine metaphysical reality. For this reason, I ultimately see both the political right and the political left moving towards similar destinations, despite their apparent disagreements. The fundamental problem lies deeper than politics. It lies in a worldview that increasingly treats matter as the primary reality and reduces all other dimensions of existence to secondary status. The right at least preserves remnants of traditional moral frameworks, even if those traditions are often weakened, distorted, or inconsistently applied. The left, by contrast, frequently pushes further toward relativism, materialism, and the fragmentation of shared meaning. Everything becomes individualized, relativized, and detached from any larger vision of life. These developments, in my view, are consequences of abandoning meaning itself. They emerge when living beings inhabiting a living reality begin to understand themselves as products of a dead and mechanical universe. The result is a kind of cultural dystopia in which reality appears to turn against itself. One example can be seen in attempts to use technological intervention to transcend or redefine fundamental aspects of human nature. Certain movements on the left promote the alteration of traditional distinctions between men and women through increasingly sophisticated medical and technological means. To me, this already represents a form of transhumanism, a movement toward reshaping humanity through technology rather than understanding humanity through nature. Yet the same tendency exists on the right in different forms. Both sides participate in a broader movement toward technological expansion and social transformation. Both contribute, in their own ways, to a civilization that becomes increasingly detached from the natural foundations of human existence. Beneath their disagreements lies a shared commitment to a vision of progress defined by technological advancement, material prosperity, and the pursuit of ever greater control over the conditions of life. This vision resembles a secular religion whose ultimate goal is the creation of a technological utopia. It promises that scientific progress and material abundance will eventually satisfy all human needs. Yet in pursuing this goal, it risks severing humanity's connection to nature, community, spirit, and meaning. The struggle for survival becomes a struggle against reality itself. In attempting to master nature completely, we risk destroying the very qualities that make life worth living. Human beings are part of nature. To flourish, they must remain aligned with their natural tendencies rather than engage in endless conflict against them. The modern worldview often encourages precisely the opposite approach, and this is why I describe it as fundamentally lifeless. My own philosophical concern is therefore directed against any worldview that denies the living character of reality. I see reality not as a collection of disconnected mechanical parts, but as a vast living whole whose elements derive their meaning through their participation in that whole. Once we cease to recognize that reality itself is the ground of our life, we begin to imagine ourselves as isolated organisms struggling against a dead universe. In doing so, we lose sight of our place within the living order to which we belong. From this perspective, the ideological religion of liberal democracy contains within itself a self-destructive tendency. Every system built upon a false understanding of reality eventually begins to consume the very people who support it. Symbolically speaking, it resembles the traditional image of the devil, a force that persuades individuals to serve its purposes and, once those purposes have been fulfilled, turns against them. The deeper meaning of the devil's rebellion against God is precisely this act of self-destruction. By rebelling against God, the devil rebels against the very source of his own existence. In rejecting the ground of being, he condemns himself to negation and eventual ruin. Those who follow such a path participate in the same logic. The devil, however, should not be understood merely as a mythical creature with horns and a tail. Rather, the devil is both an idea and being. To follow the devil means to embody principles that ultimately lead toward destruction. It means participating in a movement that turns against its own foundations. This is how I interpret many of the developments occurring within modern Western civilization. Societies possess something analogous to a soul, just as individuals do. Every nation, community, culture, and civilization embodies certain meanings, values, and ideals that give it identity and coherence. The soul of a community and the soul of the individual are not separate realities, but interconnected expressions of the same structure of meaning. In the final book of the Bible, the Book of Revelation, the New Jerusalem appears as the archetypal image of the perfect city of God, while Babylon stands as its opposite. These two cities symbolize the enduring conflict between good and evil that unfolds throughout all of history. They should not be understood merely as specific political systems or historical governments. Rather, they function as archetypal realities, eternal patterns or Platonic forms that serve as models of perfection and corruption. Every particular government, society, and civilization participates to some degree in the struggle represented by these two cities, embodying aspects of one or the other throughout different periods of history. Saint Augustine later described these realities as the city of God and the city of the devil. The city of God represents the eternal order of harmony, truth, and proper alignment. It is the realm in which God and the heavenly hosts dwell, expressing perfect unity between being, truth, and goodness. Truth itself is a form of order. Whatever is true possesses a definite structure that makes it what it is. In political terms, this can be understood as an ideal form of government or society. The more an earthly state aligns itself with this higher pattern, the more it moves towards stability, prosperity, and the flourishing of its people. In contrast, the city of the devil represents the archetype of corruption, deception, and disorder. It embodies rebellion against truth and opposition to the principles that sustain harmony. According to the biblical narrative, the devil and a portion of the angels rebelled against God and the heavenly order that he represents. Because these beings became identified with disorder and rebellion, they were cast out from the heavenly city so that its integrity and truthfulness could remain intact. After this expulsion, these demonic powers constructed their own city of chaos. This primordial event is not merely a story about a distant past. It functions as an archetypal pattern that continually manifests throughout human history. The Book of Revelation presents this pattern in symbolic form, showing how the eternal conflict between order and chaos, truth and falsehood, God and rebellion, unfolds within the world. Earthly history becomes a particular expression of this deeper and universal struggle. Every age, every nation, every community, and every individual soul participates in this drama in one way or another. From this perspective, the defeat of the demonic powers is also not merely a past occurrence. Their defeat is already established at the archetypal level, yet the pattern of rebellion and judgment continues to appear throughout history. Every historical struggle, every moral decision, every rise and fall of civilizations reflects this timeless blueprint. The battle has already been won, and yet it is forever being enacted, because each moment of history enters into and expresses the same eternal drama. According to this interpretation, Adam and Eve, as the archetypal man and woman, chose to listen to the voice of the devil and thereby aligned themselves with the principle of disorder rather than the principle of truth. As a result, they were expelled from paradise and banished into the city of the fallen angels. By turning away from truth, they entered a state characterized by decay, mortality, and separation from the source of life. In this symbolic framework, Eternal truth and eternal order are inseparable from life itself, while chaos and disorder represent movement toward death. Once they aligned themselves with rebellion against truth, they found themselves outside the heavenly city of God and within a world increasingly influenced by forces of corruption and disorder. Once this archetypal reality is understood, it becomes clear why earthly history continually reflects it. This does not imply that human beings lack freedom. On the contrary, freedom itself is expressed within this ongoing struggle between order and disorder. The archetypal pattern does not dictate specific actions or predict particular historical events. Instead, it provides a timeless framework within which free actions occur. Human beings remain free to choose, yet regardless of those choices, the underlying pattern remains true. Babylon is not only destined to be destroyed in the future, it is already undergoing destruction as a consequence of its own nature. In this sense, the pattern contains both past and future simultaneously. For this reason, attempts to reduce the Book of Revelation to a sequence of historical predictions often miss its deeper significance. Such interpretations risk diminishing its universality by treating it merely as a forecast of future events. Revelation should instead be understood as an eternal blueprint embedded within the structure of reality itself. It functions much like a Platonic form, an unchanging truth that exists beyond time while continuously expressing itself within time. Those who recognize this can observe the same archetypal patterns appearing throughout different eras and political systems. In every age, it becomes possible to distinguish those aspects of society that move toward the order symbolized by the heavenly Jerusalem and those that move toward the disorder symbolized by Babylon. The names Jerusalem and Babylon should therefore not be interpreted only as references to specific geographical locations or literal cities. They function as symbols that point toward deeper realities. Babylon appears in the Book of Revelation through the powerful image of the great harlot described in chapter 17. Within this symbolic framework, Babylon represents the city of the devil, the archetypal image of a civilization whose values have been inverted. It is a society that has abandoned truth and order in favor of deception and corruption. The kings of the earth are portrayed as giving their allegiance to this woman because they have lost their orientation toward what is genuinely good. Rather than grounding themselves in truth, wisdom, and divine order, principles traditionally expressed through religion, philosophy, and the sacred traditions embodied in the Church and its saints, they become captivated by a false image of power and glory. The saints symbolize those who dedicate themselves to truth and align their lives with the divine attributes represented by God. To the extent that a person or society follows these principles, they belong symbolically to the heavenly Jerusalem, the city of God. Babylon stands as the opposite of this order. It represents falsehood masquerading as truth, disorder disguised as harmony, and manipulation concealed beneath appearances of legitimacy. It presents itself as something noble and beautiful, yet beneath the surface it embodies corruption and chaos. Revelation describes Babylon as adorned with precious jewels, gold, and luxurious garments. These ornaments symbolize an external appearance of greatness, but their purpose is to conceal an inner emptiness. The brilliance is only a mask. Babylon seeks to appear as a queen, but in reality she is a prostitute, a mother of all prostitutes. She holds a golden cup, yet that cup is filled with abominations. The image suggests a civilization that attempts to present corruption as virtue and ugliness as beauty. Those who rule the nations become intoxicated by this illusion. Having drunk from the cup, they lose the ability to distinguish truth from deception. Their values become inverted, and they give their loyalty to the whore of Babylon as though she were their rightful queen. Revelation further depicts her as drunk on the blood of the saints, indicating that she opposes and persecutes those who remain faithful to truth and divine order. The great harlot is shown seated upon a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. The 7 heads are associated with mountains and kingdoms, symbolizing political powers and rulers. According to the vision, the 7 kings connected with these kingdoms represent successive powers, some of which had already fallen at the time the text was written, while others remained. The 10 horns symbolize additional rulers who had not yet received kingdoms. These future kings are presented as participants in a larger political and spiritual order that derives its power from Babylon. Together they represent a vast network of earthly powers aligned with the archetypal principle embodied by the city of the devil. They participate in a system characterized by deception, corruption, and the inversion of values. Because Babylon is drunk on the blood of the saints, this order stands in opposition to those who seek truth and remain loyal to God. It consumes and persecutes those who refuse to abandon divine order for worldly power. Revelation presents another woman whose symbolism stands in direct contrast to Babylon. This woman is clothed with the sun, with the moon beneath her feet and a crown of stars upon her head. Unlike the great harlot, she represents life, truth, and the goodness of creation. Her imagery is drawn from the natural order itself, the sun, moon, and stars, suggesting harmony with the structure of reality established by God. She can be understood as the wife of God, or the heavenly Jerusalem, a symbolic opposite of the whore of Babylon. She at the same time represents the church in its true form, not a particular church in history, but the church established in spirit, which is an eternal structure constructed from meaning or the raw material of truth, and it is filled with souls who embody its principles, no matter to which particular church in history they belong to. We can call ourselves Christians, and we can use the symbols, labels, and slogans connected to the particular church in history, but this does not make us followers of Christ, because the real church is located in the spirit, and it is found within our souls, not on any particular location on the earth map. The woman is pregnant and brings forth a savior into the world, and for this reason she becomes the target of the great dragon, who represents the devil. The dragon seeks to destroy the child before his mission can be fulfilled, but divine intervention prevents this outcome. God protects the woman and defeats the forces aligned against her. In the end, Babylon is judged and brought to destruction, while the heavenly Jerusalem is established as the fulfillment of God's order. The vision concludes with the image of a new heaven and a new earth, where truth, harmony, and divine order ultimately triumph over deception, corruption, and chaos. The heavenly Jerusalem is described in Revelation through imagery of extraordinary beauty and perfection. John portrays it as a city made of pure gold, yet so refined that it appears transparent like glass. Its radiance resembles a precious jewel, shining with the clarity of crystal-like jasper. Even the streets are said to be fashioned from pure gold that reflects light like transparent glass. The city is built in the form of a perfect square and enclosed by walls of jasper, emphasizing its harmony, balance, and completeness. According to Revelation 21 verse 16, its height, length, and width are equal, mirroring the proportions of the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle and the first temple. Its immense dimensions symbolize not merely physical size, but spiritual perfection and divine order. The New Jerusalem is also presented as a place of universal inclusion. Its 12 gates welcome the 12 tribes of Israel from every direction of the earth, suggesting a gathering together of humanity under a unified divine order. Unlike earthly cities, however, it contains no separate temple building. God and the Lamb themselves are its temple because their presence fills the entire city. There is no distinction between sacred and ordinary space, since the whole city has become sacred. John further describes a river of the water of life flowing from the throne of God through the center of the city. Alongside this river grows the tree of life, extending to both banks and bearing 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit throughout the year. The leaves of this tree are given for the healing of the nations. This imagery recalls the Garden of Eden and suggests a restoration of the life that humanity once lost. The tree of life becomes a symbol of renewal, wholeness, and participation in eternal life. John also emphasizes that the New Jerusalem is completely free from sin and corruption. Those who dwell there share in the divine likeness and bear the name of God upon their foreheads, signifying their participation in holiness. Darkness no longer exists within the city, and there is no need for lamps or even the light of the sun, because God Himself illuminates everything. The inhabitants live directly within the light of truth and divine presence. John concludes his vision by stressing the everlasting nature of this reality. Those who belong to this city reign forever and ever. The New Jerusalem therefore stands as an image of perfect harmony, where truth, life, and divine order have been fully realized. If human beings wish to live well upon the earth, they must recognize the significance of this pattern. Revelation portrays the kings of the earth as deceived because they place their trust in falsehood rather than truth. Babylon represents the fallen order established through rebellion against God, just as Adam and Eve accepted the voice of the serpent and chose another authority in place of divine wisdom. By turning away from God, they aligned themselves with a principle opposed to truth and were consequently expelled from the divine order represented by the city of God. Their exile symbolizes the human condition itself, a state in which humanity repeatedly becomes entangled with deception and disorder. The task of human beings is therefore to reverse this condition by rejecting the rule of falsehood and reorienting themselves toward God as the highest authority. When God is recognized as king, the entire city becomes a temple because every aspect of life is ordered around truth, goodness, and the sacred. The goal is not merely the physical construction of a perfect society, but the transformation of the soul. Once values are properly aligned and truth occupies its rightful place, the character of a community is fundamentally changed. The place itself is transformed because the principles governing it have changed. Conversely, when deception becomes dominant and societies organize themselves around false values, they begin to take on the character symbolized by Babylon. Corruption starts presenting itself as virtue, disorder disguises itself as order, and what is destructive is mistaken for what is good. In such conditions, society gradually assumes the form of spiritual ugliness and decay. No matter how attractive it may initially appear, a civilization founded upon deception ultimately moves toward collapse because falsehood cannot permanently sustain itself. The contrast between Babylon and the heavenly Jerusalem, therefore, represents more than a future event. It symbolizes two possible orientations of the soul and of society, one directed toward truth, life, and divine order, and the other toward deception, corruption, and eventual destruction. In the modern West, many people have come to view themselves as independent from the traditions and spiritual foundations that shaped their societies. In doing so, they fail to recognize that their own identity remains deeply connected to the soul of the community from which they emerged. The devil's rebellion can be understood in a similar way. He desired autonomy and dominion over reality itself, yet he forgot that he remained part of the very order he sought to oppose. By rebelling against the kingdom of God, he ultimately rebelled against his own nature and against the source of his own being. In a certain sense, this resembles Hegel's concept of negation. Hegel argues that things are defined not only by what they are, but also by what they are not. Reality unfolds through a dialectical movement in which contradictions and negations play an essential role. Some interpreters use this aspect of Hegel's philosophy to argue that he rejected all stable structures and embraced a form of perpetual relativism. I believe this interpretation misunderstands the nature of negation within Hegel's system. Negation does not endlessly dissolve all order and meaning. On the contrary, negation itself is eventually negated. The dialectical process does not abolish structure, but generates and preserves it. Contradiction serves a purpose within the unfolding of reality. It does not destroy rational order, but participates in its development. Structure exists not despite negation, but precisely through it. Negation is one of the mechanisms by which reality becomes what it is. From the standpoint of idealism, reality consists fundamentally of meaning and life, which I regard as inseparable. Even contradictions must therefore possess a meaningful role within the larger development of existence. They cannot simply negate reality itself. Rather, they contribute to the process through which reality unfolds and becomes actual. Contradictions are incorporated into the whole instead of standing outside it. Consequently, negation does not relativize reality. It strengthens and reinforces the rational structure underlying reality. This interpretation aligns with Hegel's broader philosophical project. His famous claim that what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational, leaves little room for understanding negation as an irrational force standing in opposition to reality. Negation must itself participate in rationality. It functions as a tool of actualization, not as a principle of chaos. If actuality and rationality are ultimately united, then every moment within the dialectical process must be subordinate to that unity. For this reason, I do not believe Hegel can easily be transformed into a philosopher of modern progressive relativism. His metaphysical framework leads him toward highly concrete conclusions regarding social and political life. His views on family, nation, religion, and culture emerge from what he regarded as the rational development of spirit itself. Whether one agrees with these conclusions or not, they cannot simply be detached from the foundations of his philosophy. Hegel did not view distinctions between races, peoples, nations, or historical communities as arbitrary inventions that could be altered at will. Rather, he saw them as concrete manifestations of spirit's development within history, a necessary development rooted in metaphysical necessity. The same applies to his understanding of political institutions. For Hegel, nations were not accidental constructions but rational products of historical and spiritual development. They possessed a genuine significance grounded in the structure of reality itself. His understanding of the family followed a similar pattern. The family was not merely a social arrangement created through convenience or preference. It represented a concrete ethical institution through which spirit became actual in human life. Family, religion, and nation were therefore not temporary constructs awaiting replacement, but necessary expressions of a deeper rational order. Hegel regarded them as products of a divine logic unfolding through history. This is one reason he remained critical of democracy and expressed support for constitutional monarchy. He believed that the nation occupied a central place in the realization of ethical life, and that political institutions should embody the rational development of spirit rather than simply reflect shifting public opinion. Consequently, there is little room in Hegel's philosophy for the kind of radical relativism often associated with contemporary political culture. This does not mean that Hegel rejected progress. He certainly believed in development, transformation, and historical advancement. However, progress for Hegel was not the continual dismantling of institutions, traditions, and inherited forms of life. It was the progressive actualization of rational order through institutions such as family, religion, and the state. These institutions were not obstacles to be overcome, but vehicles through which spirit realized itself in history. Within such a framework, concepts like contradiction and negation never function independently of the whole. They remain subordinate to the rational and divine logic guiding reality's development. Everything participates in a larger process of actualization governed by necessity rather than arbitrary choice. This is why I believe Hegel leaves very little room for contemporary political worldviews grounded in materialism, relativism, and the rejection of metaphysical foundations. His philosophy is inseparable from concepts such as spirit, meaning, God, religion, and the rational structure of existence itself. Remove these elements, and one is no longer interpreting Hegel, but constructing an entirely different philosophy under his name. In my view, all living beings, and indeed all of reality, can ultimately be understood as ideas within the mind of God. God is the supreme universal mind, the eternal spirit, and the absolute idea that contains within itself the source of all existence. What Plato called the form of the good, and what later idealists would describe as the absolute idea, represents the highest aspect of divine being. One might compare it to the Father within the Christian conception of the Trinity. The Logos, by contrast, is the activity of this absolute spirit, the rational principle through which reality is ordered and intelligible. For logic to be truly eternal and universal, it must contain within itself timeless truths and concepts. These are the eternal realities that do not change, what Plato described as the intelligible or noetic realm. Just as individual beings can be understood as ideas, God is simultaneously both the highest being and the highest idea, containing within himself all other ideas and extending them throughout every level of existence, including the material world. In this respect, I find myself in agreement with Hegel's idealism and his attempt to unite thought and being. However, I follow Plato in maintaining a stronger distinction between the eternal and the finite. I believe that the eternal is present within the finite because the finite cannot exist independently of it. Yet I do not entirely agree with Hegel's tendency to place all reality within an ongoing process of development and contradiction. Hegel certainly recognized the universal and the particular, the infinite and the finite, and he acknowledged an eternal dimension within reality. Nevertheless, he understood this eternal dimension as inseparable from a dialectical movement of becoming. His philosophy is fundamentally concerned with contradictions, their resolution, and the continual unfolding of reality through these processes. Contradiction is not an accidental feature of existence for Hegel, but one of its essential characteristics. This differs significantly from Plato's vision. In Plato there exists a realm of eternal forms whose meanings do not change. These realities remain what they are independently of temporal processes. It is here that I believe Hegel's philosophy falls short of a complete account of reality. I think Hegel brilliantly describes the movement of ideas as they pass through the realm of becoming, yet I believe that beyond this process there must also exist a higher category of eternal and unchanging truths. Without such truths, I do not see how reality itself could possess coherence. Change, in my view, can only occur within a framework that is itself unchanging. Even if reality is characterized by perpetual transformation, the very fact that change exists is itself a stable and eternal truth. The principle that makes change possible cannot itself be merely another instance of change. It must belong to a higher order of reality that provides the conditions under which becoming can occur. Thus, even an endlessly evolving universe presupposes something permanent that grounds and sustains that evolution. When it comes to Hegel, what is unchanging is the dialectical logic through which reality, thought, and spirit necessarily develop. This means that even this ever-changing logic indicates that it rests on some deeper ground. It has some kind of rules, and I would say that such rules are eternal unchanging facts. I would say that such rules are not necessary only for logic, but for all reality and its different aspects. After all, in Hegel's system the movement of reality itself is logic, and I claim that this logic is itself the embodiment of the eternal and unchanging facts. Hegel says that pure being, the most unchanging concept imaginable, collapses into nothing, and only their movement, becoming, is real. I don't think this can be called pure being. I think that Hegel is just describing becoming. Even when he refers to pure being, he actually refers to the starting phase of becoming where being is no longer pure. But even if this Hegelian dialectic is everything that ever happened, the rules of this happening are the unchanging facts. For example, if becoming is happening, there is a meaning that tells us what this becoming is. There is an unchanging eternal fact of what becoming essentially contains in all its different forms. Even change, the nature of change is itself the unchanging eternal fact. When we say change is happening, there is this higher category of meaning that is present and allows us to recognize all forms of change no matter their nature. Change is when something is like this in one moment and like that in the other, and this is in itself. This description alone captures the meaning that is the unchanging fact necessary for any kind of change if it is to take place. You could claim that Hegel would say that this fact is not real in itself, but is just a description of one part or the beginning of the dialectical exchange or something. But this is just my opinion. This is where I personally disagree with Hegel. I believe that as soon as we can speak about something, as soon as we can refer to its realness, there is a meaningful part of it that must be real and concrete in some meaningful sense. Even when I imagine a dinosaur with 3 lion heads, this imagined image is a combination of various meaningful aspects of reality. So even this absurd image has some kind of meaningful and concrete reality. If it didn't, I wouldn't be able to speak about it or describe it in any way. I am not saying that the dinosaur with 3 lion heads exists. I am saying that this image contains some kind of meaningful concreteness, like shape, number, essence, that we can always recognize in all their different manifestations. Everything we can refer to has at least an aspect of eternal meaning and concreteness. If it didn't, there would literally be no way to have a consistent basis on which we can even speak about it. This may not be obvious in this moment, but I believe that after a long time of contemplation, one necessarily comes to this conclusion. The fact that I am able to describe it in one moment, and that you are able to interpret it in a meaningful way in the other moment, it is necessary that there is some concrete ideal behind all notions and images, and this is the ground on which we are able to recognize it. This is the ground on which I am criticizing Hegel right now. I believe he did not include this aspect of reality in his system. The part where Hegel necessarily describes something eternal is in connection to the absolute, but everything is at the end a part of the absolute. However, the absolute is not a static entity but a self-relating, self-developing whole. Yet its method, the dialectical movement of a concept, its negation, their higher reconciliation, remains constant across all domains: logic, nature, spirit. I would say that the rules under which this process is happening is unchanging fact. The meaning of what negation means, the meaning of what logic means, these are eternal unchanging facts. Logic has some specific characteristics that make it logical, and this is unchanging meaning or fact, or Platonic idea. I would say that even the absoluteness itself, of the absolute, is an eternal unchanging fact. I'm not referring to what the absolute does. Hegel describes what the absolute does, and this is reality, but I claim that the description that captures this meaning of the absoluteness, as the true nature of the absolute, is in itself an eternal unchanging fact. I believe this is necessary for any kind of realness. As soon as something is real, there is this descriptive claim that refers to the ideal part of anything real, that stands as eternal fact outside of time, and whenever you notice it within time it is always of the same nature. Hegel does truly believe in the absolute and in the eternal part of the idea, but he always speaks about it through his philosophy of progression through history. This is what most progressive liberals often capture, but they completely dismiss the part where Hegel rejects their tendencies towards total dissolution of all facts. Hegel believed that the eternal is mediated through or reflects itself through the particular that is at the same time a part of itself, as he writes in the Science of Logic. Thus all the oppositions that are assumed as fixed, as for example finite and infinite, individual and universal, are not in contradiction through, say, an external connection. On the contrary, as an examination of their nature has shown, they are in and for themselves a transition. The synthesis and the subject in which they appear is the product of their notion's own reflection. If a consideration that ignores the notion stops short at their external relationship, isolates them and leaves them as fixed presuppositions, it is the notion, on the contrary, that keeps them steadily in view, moves them as their soul and brings out their dialectic. Taken quite generally, this determination can be taken to mean that what is at first immediate now appears as mediated, related to another, or that the universal appears as a particular. Hence the second term that has thereby come into being is the negative of the first, and if we anticipate the subsequent progress, the first negative. The immediate, from this negative side, has been extinguished in the other, but the other is essentially not the empty negative, the nothing, that is taken to be the usual result of dialectic. Rather is it the other of the first, the negative of the immediate. It is therefore determined as the mediated, contains in general the determination of the first within itself. Consequently, the first is essentially preserved and retained even in the other. To hold fast to the positive in its negative, in the content of the presupposition, in the result, this is the most important feature in rational cognition. At the same time, only the simplest reflection is needed to convince one of the absolute truth and necessity of this requirement, and so far as examples of the proof of this are concerned, the whole of logic consists of such. So Hegel is not saying that universal truths do not exist, but his philosophy is mainly concerned with explaining the process through which reality logically unfolds. This universal is not negated by particular, it is mediated by the negation. The particular is the other of itself, or the universal. Negation is not cancelling of anything. It is the means of rational unfolding in consciousness, which is intrinsically incomplete in its grasp of the absolute idea, which contains everything at once, and is the absolute truth. This is exactly what Hegel writes in the Science of Logic. The negative appears as the mediating element, since it includes within it itself and the immediate whose negation it is. So far as these two determinations are taken in some relationship or other as externally related, the negative is only the formal mediating element. But as absolute negativity, the negative moment of absolute mediation is the unity which is subjectivity and soul. Everything that ever happens and will ever happen is the absolute returning to itself, but from our particularized perspective, this returning is the entire history of reality. So when seen through this perspective of the absolute, we as particular individuals do not get to shape our progress as we like, as many liberal Hegelians claim. We are free to adopt the freedom that the absolute provides, and by becoming conscious of its rational movement, we can align with a kind of progress that preserves our well-being. So there is a kind of nature or structure to this unfolding, and some paths bring harm and others bring well-being. But we don't get to do what we want and arbitrarily decide what is good and what is bad because we are all part of the absolute that is in progress. We don't get to decide what this rational movement means. We either align with rational movement in a way that it brings out our well-being, or we go against it and end up doing harm to ourselves and society. Hegel never claimed that we can go against the rational unfolding of the absolute by destroying institutions and nations in the name of progress like modern liberals do, at least not without consequences. Because, in this case, we ourselves will become the negated part in the dialectical unfolding. By trying to negate the rational unfolding by going against its nature, we will become a part of negation, and at the end we will negate ourselves. So there is some kind of requirement to be a part of reality. There is something that it is like to contribute to the rational unfolding of reality, and this is what our task is. It is to align with proper progression of reality through negation. It is not our task to be the negation, or to negate reality in some way. To negate reality means to negate ourselves. Our purpose is to live through it and to contribute to unfolding of reality. This is what Hegel calls rational cognition or logic. It is the unfolding of the absolute idea through negation, but negation is not some kind of cancelling of reality. Negation is exactly what creates reality. It is what makes reality real. And negation at the end is negated by itself, which is exactly what makes each individual soul, and this is at the same time why reality is concrete and real. Hegel writes it like this in The Science of Logic. Now the negativity just considered constitutes the turning point of the movement of the notion. It is the simple point of the negative relation to self, the innermost source of all activity of all animate and spiritual self-movement, the dialectical soul that everything true possesses and through which alone it is true. For on this subjectivity alone rests the sublating of the opposition between the notion and reality, and the unity that is truth. The second negative, the negative of the negative, at which we have arrived, is this sublating of the contradiction, but just as little as the contradiction is it an act of external reflection, but rather the innermost, most objective moment of life and spirit through which a subject, a person, a free being, exists. A few lines down he writes, "In this turning point of the method, the course of cognition at the same time returns into itself. As self-sublating contradiction, this negativity is the restoration of the first immediacy, of simple universality. For the other of the other, the negative of the negative, is immediately the positive, the identical, the universal." Hegel in essence is not even opposed to Plato. He is in fact in alignment on many issues, more than people usually think, but what Hegel focuses on in his philosophy is the unfolding of reality. It is not that Hegel destroyed the eternal and universal in order to particularize and relativize it through history, as is often presented in non-metaphysical interpretations. It is the opposite. Hegel describes unfolding through history, while preserving the eternal and universal through pure rational divine intelligence, or what he called the science of logic. Hegel writes, "The universal constitutes the foundation. The advance is therefore not to be taken as a flowing from one other to the next other. In the absolute method, the notion maintains itself in its otherness, the universal in its particularization, in judgment and reality. At each stage of its further determination, it raises the entire mass of its preceding content, and by its dialectical advance it not only does not lose anything or leave anything behind, but carries along with it all it has gained, and inwardly enriches and consolidates itself." In some way Hegel wanted to finish what Plato started. At least this is how I see his mission. He saw his mission as trying to complete the goal of Western philosophy that properly started with Plato. I also must give credit to philosophers who came before Plato, but Plato marked the beginning. He created a system that began the dialectic of philosophy itself, and Hegel finished it. And as I already said, These philosophers that came after, the postmodernists, I don't even know if I would call them philosophers. This systematic thinking is in my opinion crucial for someone who calls themselves a philosopher, starting with foundation of metaphysics to the most immediate reality of everyday experience. This is the line where Plato and Hegel are most aligned. Plato took from Parmenides the realm of being and Heraclitus the realm of becoming, and his goal was understanding how they are related to one another. But Hegel in some way continued, or his goal was to finish or to complete the system by collapsing this being and becoming into unity and explaining how this gives birth to reality and history. But what I don't like about Hegel is that his reality is not as concrete as I believe it should be. In Hegel, even the universal and eternal truth is going through the process of becoming. I agree that universal and eternal are participating in the process, but in my opinion, these provide the ground or reality for the process. But Hegel claims that they become directly a part of it, and as reality is changing, these eternal and universal truths are changing and developing as well. I respectfully disagree on this point. My view is that in order for reality to be real, we need that concrete realism of Plato that contains the ground of concrete facts that provide the stable ground for realness of anything. I believe that only in this way things can truly be real. To be fair, Hegel is not too far from this. He is not a relativist, as many people say. All his concepts are grounded in metaphysical necessity, but at the same time he is not fully there when it comes to concrete realness of ideas. I do not wish to pursue this point too far, since it introduces a number of additional complications. Yet the central idea remains important. Thought and being are fundamentally united. While Hegel is often credited with bringing about this synthesis, I believe Plato had already moved in this direction long before him. In dialogues such as the Phaedo, Plato suggests that soul and life themselves possess the character of forms. Life is not merely a biological process, but an intelligible reality, a kind of idea. The souls of living beings can therefore be understood as participating in, or even embodying, eternal forms. Although Plato does not fully develop this position in a systematic way, he repeatedly points toward it. In the Phaedo especially, he argues that the soul must be immortal because it participates in the form of life. Since life cannot admit its opposite, namely death, the soul cannot ultimately be destroyed. Life, as a form, remains eternal. Hegel approaches this issue differently. Within his philosophy, particular beings and finite forms of life can pass away because contradiction and negation are essential elements of reality. Death functions as a moment within the dialectical process. Life encounters its negation and is transformed through that encounter. And I would say that Plato would agree with Hegel on this issue, but as long as you put it entirely in the world of becoming, or the material world, individual dies, while the form or the idea of life or the soul remains what it always was. Now what would Plato say about what this means when an individual dies I do not know. We also must understand that Plato wrote in dialogues. It is not certain how strongly he believed this. And also, as I said earlier, Plato did not directly develop the unity of thought and being, but he implied it on a few occasions. I can try to describe it like this through Platonic metaphysics. Maybe the idea of life is some kind of blueprint or ideal essence that through the power of the world soul provides the form of life for all living beings. And when each particular being dies, it returns through the world soul to the absolute or the idea of the good, while the world soul continues to provide the form of life to all other beings that continue to live. On this example, we see how the relationship between universal and particular differs from Hegel to Plato. As a result, Hegel leaves little room for a completely static realm of eternal facts. Even what is eternal appears as part of a dynamic process of self-development. Yet this movement should not be mistaken for randomness or uncertainty. Hegel's system remains governed by necessity. Nevertheless, it is also the point at which I believe his system remains vulnerable to misunderstanding. Because he emphasizes development, process, and historical unfolding, later thinkers have often interpreted him in ways that move toward relativism. I believe such interpretations distort Hegel's actual intentions, but they become possible because of the central role that movement and progression play within his thought. My criticism of Hegel, therefore, concerns neither his commitment to logic nor his commitment to necessity. On the contrary, His entire system is grounded in rational structure. The difficulty is that he gives priority to process rather than to immutable realities that stand beyond process. While he succeeds in grounding development within a metaphysics of reason and necessity, I believe his philosophy would be more complete if it included a stronger account of eternal and unchanging truths. In some way, Hegel here takes Platonic forms and interprets them through the philosophy of Aristotle. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of why Plato said that ideas or forms must be unchanging. Plato is often criticized for his exaggerated realism, but this is exactly the point. If realism is not exaggerated, nothing can ever be real. Either it is real or it is not. If existence exists, it can't be defined by not existing. If reality is to be real in any sense, there must be a place where dialectic comes from, or where dialectic has no effect and is illusory. In my view, if we take Neoplatonic conception of reality as three hypostases of the One, the Demiurge, and the world soul, this dialectical development is happening entirely in this lower sphere, in the world soul, or what in my personal Christian interpretation would belong to the domain of the Holy Spirit, while Logos, or the Demiurge, and the One, are higher principles that contain static unchanging facts, while the world soul is a mediator between the infinite eternal universal and finite changing particular. This is where I see by far the greatest mistake in Hegel. Progress presupposes a stable order that makes progress possible. Hegel believed that we shouldn't give primacy to any specific part of reality because all its so-called parts, like spirit and nature for example, are at the end expressions of the absolute. So Hegel believed that the truth is the whole. I agree that the truth is the whole, but at the same time each part of this whole in itself contains in some sense wholeness itself. This is how I see it, which is where I draw from the philosophy of Leibniz, who was also an idealist, with his theory of monads. I would even say that Leibniz was a Pythagorean in a way he interpreted reality. The entire reality is a monad, but each smaller monad is at the same time united with the whole as its part, and it is at the same time the whole in itself. This can only be properly imagined if the world of becoming is not a primary reality, and Leibniz believed this. He believed in the opposite of Newton, that reality of time and space is relative, we could even say to some extent illusory, but true reality is that of monads, that are imagined as mind-like substance that permeates the entire reality. Hegel's way of seeing reality through collapsing everything into unity of becoming does not allow him to properly define some aspects of reality. I simply cannot shake this thought when I think about Hegel's philosophy. So I agree with Hegel that the truth is the whole, but parts of the truth are themselves the whole. Even the small part of the truth is in itself the truth in its entirety if understood properly. It is necessary to believe in the concrete truthfulness of all individual things, because this gives us a proper ground on which we can create a hierarchy of values based on the value that each part, as the truth in itself, plays a role in the whole. I believe that all things are parts of truth, but the truth of some parts depends on the truth of others, while the truth of those others does not depend on the truth of those first ones. So some things depend on others that are independent from them. In this way, I don't think we can easily conclude that all truth is equally valuable. Yes, all truth is equally true, but some truths have greater capacity to preserve this truthfulness than others. It is simply impossible that the eternal and unchanging fact enters into the process of change, and it is impossible that the process of change does not begin or depend on the eternity of that which does not change. Without an eternal foundation, no process could possess coherence, direction, or intelligibility. Thus, while I share Hegel's conviction that reality is rational, and that thought and being belong together, I ultimately remain closer to Plato in believing that all becoming must rest upon an unchanging realm of eternal necessity. Only through such permanence can the reality of change itself be understood. I agree with Hegel's conviction that history possesses a direction, and that its development is fundamentally teleological. Human history is not merely a sequence of random events, but a process moving toward determinate ends. To be perfectly clear and to avoid confusion, when I say determinate, this does not mean that things are determined in advance, but that reality is developing through freedom of spirit and consciousness according to its rational goals. So determinate means that the spirit's will drives reality towards specific ends that are not purely accidental or random. They have coherence and stability through the divine perfect knowledge that can't do wrong. Everything it does must be in accordance with its goals. Even the worst kinds of evil and suffering are actually parts of this great divine plan that is fully developed through history in the realm of becoming. Now, where I differ from Hegel is in belief that God or the divine is somehow changed or perfected through this process. I do not believe this is possible. I believe that God is perfect regardless. God does not need reality in order to complete himself. God just allows things freely and perfectly from the beginning. All things are perfected through God, but God is not the one who is being perfected. He is the place from where the perfection comes from at the start. God is so perfect that even perfection is not something that defines him. He is the source of it. He defines perfection. In this way, we can't say God needs completion. God is where the completion is already present from the beginning. You might believe that if this is true, then everything is determined in advance by God. But this is not true. This is precisely the reason why God is able to provide both perfection and freedom at once. Because freedom, like justice or goodness, is one such perfect idea in the mind of God, which God used when he created reality. Hegel believed that God is perfect because he created reality, but I think the same in reverse. God created reality because he was already perfect from the beginning. God's creation act is not the act of completion. It is the inevitable result of his completeness. God's mind is the highest idea and the realm of eternal truth. This is what makes God's knowledge perfect. The very reason God can't do wrong. Hegel describes God in grandiose terms, but in my view, he diminishes God by stating that history somehow completes him. Hegel's God is incomplete, which is why my personal opinion is that this incomplete God can never provide perfect or total freedom. Hegel is known for his philosophy of freedom, and this is precisely the point where I personally believe that he undermines this freedom by taking away the power needed to provide it. I might be wrong, but this is my personal disagreement with Hegel. I do not think that incomplete God can provide complete freedom. Perfectly reasonable flow of history means that God, through his infinite goodness and love, allows freedom to govern history towards rational goals. If freedom is not fundamental to history, this would be antithetical to love and reason. Love and reason can only be expressed through freedom. There is no other way. In order to achieve this, history must be a realm of change, but in order for it to be governed by perfect freedom and love, it also must be a deficient sphere that is governed or that depends on a higher category of perfect and concrete ideas that stand as eternal blueprints of perfect rationality. In this way, even seemingly relative and uncertain history ends up reaching towards ultimate goodness. This does not mean that some kind of supernatural fantastical world exists in the sky. It just means that there is some kind of information storage, like in the computer. I think you would agree that computer is not supernatural, and yet we can use this to create virtual worlds from this information stored within it. In this way, there is some kind of information storage that was used to model reality. So reality is like a game that we all play, while this information storage of ideas is the computer. This higher realm corresponds to what Plato described as the intelligible world, the noetic sphere of pure reason. It is a realm in which nothing is arbitrary, where truth exists in its fully actualized form and does not require any process of realization. These truths are already complete. They do not become what they are through historical development because they exist beyond development altogether. They constitute the permanent foundation that makes every process possible. A process can never emerge from nothing. Every movement presupposes conditions that govern and structure it. The rules that make development possible cannot themselves be merely products of development. They must already exist as stable realities. These eternal principles form the higher category from which all becoming originates. It is within this realm that wisdom itself resides, the throne of Sophia, the eternal source of knowledge and understanding. This eternal order is, in my view, identical with the divine mind. It is the mind of God, who is both the highest being and the ground of all being. God is the source of every idea, and at the same time the supreme idea itself, what Plato called the good. In this symbolic sense, one could describe Sophia, or wisdom, as the companion of God. To approach wisdom is not merely to hold correct beliefs, or even to possess knowledge. It is to enter into a relationship with truth itself. Yet wisdom can never truly be possessed. Truth always remains, in some sense, beyond our grasp. We participate in it, and perhaps we can come to understand something of its nature, but it forever exceeds us. This may explain why the philosopher is traditionally described as a lover of wisdom rather than its owner. Wisdom is not something that can be acquired as property. It is more like a relationship between persons. Just as one cannot possess another human being, one cannot possess wisdom. One may draw closer to it or become estranged from it, but it can never belong exclusively to any individual. Human beings can know one another intimately, yet each person remains, in a certain sense, alone with themselves, as an independent being and idea. No one can entirely enter into another's inner being. The same applies to wisdom. It remains itself, both idea and being, independent of our attempts to grasp it. This is where we get a kind of Jungian archetype, Goddess Sophia, the embodiment of the idea of wisdom in a being, residing in the main court of God's kingdom in the heaven. Every being is an idea in the kingdom of God, and every idea is a kind of being or power, the archetype that is at the same time in complete alignment and unity with God, while at the same time remaining an independent entity. God's court in the heaven is where contradictions do not exist. Everyone is united while at the same time independent in this unity, and this is not a contradiction. God decides what the contradiction is. God defines it, and God decides when a contradiction stops being a contradiction. Indeed, I am more certain of this than I am of almost anything else. Human existence seems defined by an endless pursuit of wisdom that can never be fully completed. This does not mean that wisdom is unattainable because reality consists of endless contradictions, as Hegel might suggest. Rather, it is because our mode of existence requires continual striving toward a perfection that already surrounds and sustains us. We seek what is beyond us while simultaneously participating in it. The paradox is that what we pursue has been present from the very beginning. The eternal reality of God, or what Plato called the good, is at the same time beauty, truth, and love. From its highest and most perfect form, it extends throughout every level of existence, reaching even into the furthest limits of being where reality approaches chaos and nothingness. It is within this tension between eternity and nothingness that the drama of existence unfolds. Matter itself can be understood as a reflection of the eternal within the abyss of non-being. The material world resembles a mirror in which the light of truth, beauty, and goodness appears as an image. Our finite existence, therefore, cannot be separated from eternity, because a reflection cannot exist without something that is being reflected. Every finite thing derives its reality from an eternal source. At the same time, if the mirror were shattered and the reflection disappeared, the reality being reflected would remain unchanged. The eternal does not depend upon the finite. The source exists independently of its manifestations. God, understood as the highest idea and the supreme reality, is therefore not simply one participant within a dialectical process between being and nothingness. God stands above that process. This is where I depart from Hegel. I do not believe that God is ultimately subordinated to dialectic. Rather, God is the source from which dialectic originates. The movement between being and nothingness is something established by God, not something that governs God. The divine spirit may move through this process and direct its unfolding, but the fullness of God transcends it. God governs the dialectic both from within and from beyond it simultaneously. For this reason, God can never be bound by the laws that regulate reality. Those laws exist because God brought them into existence. Reality and its opposite are themselves distinctions established by the divine. By creating being, God also established the possibility of non-being as its counterpart. Thus, God does not depend upon either reality or its negation. God is the source that defines both. The boundaries between being and nothingness are not eternal principles standing above God. They are expressions of the divine will and intellect. God is therefore not subject to the structures of reality, but the origin of those structures themselves. My view is that God does not exist within a dialectical process. Rather, dialectic itself is a product of God. It is one of the principles through which manifested reality unfolds, but it cannot be elevated above its source. Dialectic governs creation because God established it as one of the structures through which existence becomes intelligible. Yet God himself remains beyond every process, relation, and category that can be applied to created reality. Whatever we may say about existence, God is the source from which it originates, but he is never subordinated to it. This is one of the areas where I depart from Hegel. In Hegel's philosophy, even the absolute appears to participate in a process of development and self-realization. In my view, however, there is an aspect of God that transcends all becoming. Certainly, God acts within reality and participates in the unfolding of events, but there is also a dimension of the divine that remains completely beyond all finite categories. No process can contain it, and no concept can fully grasp it. But this is not because it is incomplete, as it is in the process of unfolding, but because it is the ground of completeness itself. Reality is like an architectural project of a divine craftsman. When you enter a building, you don't see the foundations, but the entire reality depends upon it. Hegel argued that contradiction is an essential feature of reality, and that it permeates all things. I do not entirely accept this conclusion. Contradiction exists within creation, but it does not exist within God himself. God is not subject to contradiction because contradiction is one of the principles he established. He is the source of it, not a participant within it. The realm of ideas, the divine intellect, exists beyond all such tensions. One way to understand this is through the analogy of imagination. Suppose you create an entire world within your mind. That imagined world is an expression of your thought, a reflection of your ideas. Yet the ideas from which it is constructed already exist within your mind prior to the creation of that world. The world is dependent upon those ideas, but the ideas themselves are not dependent upon the world. This is how I conceive of God's relationship to reality. If reality consists fundamentally of thought, then existence itself is a reflection of divine thinking. The world is a manifestation of God's ideas. Yet God's mind contains infinitely more than what appears within creation. It contains the eternal forms and meanings from which creation derives its structure. This is what I understand as the eternal realm. Human beings can encounter aspects of this realm through contemplation. In moments of genuine insight, we participate in eternal truths and embody them within our finite experience. Yet we are not their source. We receive them rather than create them. God alone is the origin from which all meaning flows. If reality exists, then all of the material required to bring it into existence must already exist in some higher form. For this reason, I believe there must be an eternal and unchanging realm of meaning that precedes all manifestation. Once such a realm is acknowledged, the emergence of reality becomes intelligible. Consider, for example, something as simple as a pyramid. Before a pyramidal structure can be built from stone, there must already exist the meaning or form of the pyramid itself. The shape must be conceivable before it can be realized. That intelligible form exists within the divine intellect and can be accessed through contemplation. The essential meaning of the pyramid remains what it is regardless of whether any particular pyramid exists in the material world. Imagine that our universe were entirely destroyed and that billions of years of absolute emptiness followed. Then, after that unimaginable span of time, a new world emerged, inhabited by beings who eventually constructed pyramids. Would the pyramidal form be fundamentally different? Would it become a square or acquire characteristics completely foreign to what we understand as a pyramid? I do not think so. The name might change, the methods of construction might differ, yet the essential structure, the meaning that we have in our thoughts when we see the shape of the pyramid would remain identical. This raises an important question. If the same form can appear in different worlds separated by vast stretches of non-existence, where does that form reside? How can its meaning persist even when no physical reality exists to embody it? For me, this points directly toward eternity. Meaning itself does not depend upon material existence. Reality depends upon meaning, but meaning does not depend upon reality. The eternal forms remain what they are regardless of whether a particular world exists to express them. This eternal realm is what I identify with the mind of God. It corresponds in certain respects to what Hegel called the absolute idea, yet I interpret it differently. The absolute is not merely one pole within a dialectic of being and nothingness. Rather, it is the source that establishes the distinction between being and nothingness in the first place. It determines what counts as something and what counts as nothing. In one sense, we can say that God contains both being and non-being, because all distinctions originate from him. Yet in another sense, this statement is inadequate because God also transcends those distinctions. He is neither simply one side of the opposition nor the opposition itself. He stands prior to it. Therefore, whenever we attempt to define God through a particular conceptual framework, our definition is both true and incomplete at the same time. This is why I believe every description of the divine captures something real while simultaneously failing to exhaust its reality. To say that God is dialectical contains an element of truth, because dialectic is one of the ways divine reality manifests itself. Yet it becomes false if we claim that dialectic is the whole of God. The explanation cannot end there. But not because reality is incomplete and therefore impossible to fully capture, but because precisely the opposite is true. Even when we do not capture reality, when we are completely wrong about everything, even in this case we captured some kind of truth. The truth is not contradictory. It is so concrete that even its parts are actually the whole, and even the opposite of truth is true. When Plato writes in dialogues, he never makes it clear who is right or who is wrong. He just presents arguments as if all sides actually appear to have their own truth, and this is exactly what is happening. Explanations are not inadequate only because no explanation can explain reality. It is that explanations are inadequate because all of them actually can explain reality. Even falsehood is the truth. It is only in our finite minds, while we are still trapped in the cave, that these contradictions like truth and falsehood are happening. In the eternal realm of ideas or in the mind of God, falsehood does not exist. There is only what is true, and there is no dialectic between something and nothing. This distinction is an artificial creation of our finite minds, consequence of our life in the cave, and our inability to reach truth in its concreteness. But this can only be understood when one realizes how to get out of the cave and reach what Plato described as noesis, a realm of pure thought, completely devoid of the concept of falsehood. Plato writes, "And when I speak of the other division of the intelligible, you will understand me to speak of that other sort of knowledge which reason herself attains by the power of dialectic, using the hypotheses not as first principles, but only as hypotheses, that is to say, as steps and points of departure into a world which is above hypotheses, in order that she may soar beyond them to the first principle of the whole." This is a place where even the concept of truth becomes inadequate, because when we get here we are experiencing the truth directly. There is no need to mediate it with any kind of concepts or hypothesis. Everyone accuses Plato of escaping into higher realms away from reality, but it is the opposite. Plato's entire philosophy is about understanding reality, while all these other philosophers are still exploring the cave. The difficulty lies not in the impossibility of grasping God, but in the fact that every attempt to grasp him already occurs within the reality he makes possible. Everything points back to him because everything originates from him. Negation itself is no exception. What Hegel understood as contradiction and negation, I regard as secondary realities that arise within creation. They are not principles that govern God. They are consequences of the order God established. For this reason, I see negation not as something to which God is subjected, but as one of his products. Even contradiction ultimately belongs to the concrete fullness of divine reality. And I believe that Hegel would agree with this. However, I have a different understanding of this same thing that I am about to explain. The difference is in details, but it is of great significance. Hegel, just like me, also believed that God is at the end, the point at which contradiction starts or ends, but he at the same time believed that God goes through some kind of process to differentiate himself with contradictions. Hegel claimed that contradictions and negations are necessary for the establishment of difference within the absolute, but I claim that these differences are already established. Yes, there is a point where all differences and contradictions are united. This is the absolute or the good. I believe that me and Hegel are here in agreement. But I disagree with Hegel in claiming that the good is in some sense undergoing a contradiction as a process for establishing differences between ideas. I believe these differences are already established in the realm of pure ideas. Yes, contradictions exist, but not because God or the Absolute needs to produce differences with the help of contradictions, but because even contradictions are established by the Absolute. Contradiction itself is an eternal blueprint or idea in the eternal realm of facts. What we experience as temporary particular contradictions in reality, or in our finite cognition, is just a reflection of this eternal blueprint. This is the divine intellect from which every single concept derives its meaning. It is the source of everything and it participates in everything, but there is an aspect of its being, which is the absolute, and this aspect can't be under any rules, because rules themselves derive their meaning from its existence. Just think about how your thoughts work when you think. I personally believe that Hegel came to his conclusions in the same way. He just observed what is happening in his thoughts. If you imagine anything in your mind, the thing that you imagined is undergoing a process. Your imagination is going through a process. Or when you dream, your dream is a process. But there is this elusive place where the entire dream is happening, but at the same time the place is static. It is a place where ideas are in their original form. But only after dreaming or imagining a story these ideas start going through the process. And even after the dream ends, you could construct a new one from this place where ideas are always at your reach. They are not in process. They are just located in that darkness of mind and available for use. But this place where the process is happening is always of the same nature. It is like a blank canvas where you are able to paint anything from the information present in your mind. But when the story or the dream ends, this place where the canvas is located is always the same, and all that information that you used to do a story is still present. In this way, I believe, ideas are always present and available to God. But reality is just a story or a dream that God painted on his canvas from the ideas that are ever present in his mind. This is where the process is not happening. It is a place beyond processes. This aspect of being is not subjected to becoming. It can't be negated or changed, because if it could, reality would simply not be real. To change pure being does not mean to change its properties or something. Being is being, and it is always what it is. I don't even understand what it would mean to change being or to negate it. This is impossible. It simply makes no sense if you understand being in a way I understand it. Being is always of the same nature, and it is unchanging. If the idea of a pyramid, a universal idea that is present in the essence of all particular pyramids, its meaning of its shape, it is not even possible to imagine what it would mean for this to undergo some kind of change. This is simply not possible. But that is precisely the point. Hegel had some different kind of universality in his mind. Hegel's universals are in some sense not truly universal. They are an intersection where particularity and universality meet. I understand that realness stands in contrast to non-realness, and becoming is happening between them, but in order for this to happen, I believe that realness and unrealness must be two fixed and clearly defined and separated points of eternity, not some kinds of points in the process. Reality can become unreal because realness and unrealness are clearly defined opposites, while God is someone who defines them both. This is also where I believe me and Hegel would agree to a certain extent. Only I would say that the difference between being and nothing is a fixed eternal fact, while Hegel would say it is a consequence or two sides of the process that are at the same time united in this process. My understanding differs from Hegel's in my belief that the only way things can be united in truth is if everything derives its existence from a concrete reality of facts, while Hegel came to conclusion that the only way to unite things is by collapsing everything into a process. I can see that reality is in a process, but in my view, process is something that has a source. Even if process is eternal, there must be eternal source. In this way, only way to truly unite everything is by concluding that all parts of the process derive its existence from the blueprint that was forever present in the source. While Hegel believed the opposite. He saw that reality is changing, and the only way to truly unite everything is by claiming that everything is literally undergoing change at the same time. But my view of reality comes from a perspective that time itself is a byproduct. Change itself is a byproduct. If it is true that realness must be eternally real in order for it to be real in any sense, this would mean that time itself is some kind of byproduct or lower dimension. Even Plato says in the Timaeus that time is created by the demiurge. So Plato knew this. In Hegel, everything must participate in time, and this is where I personally must disagree. So it is not so small, this disagreement between me and Hegel. It is in fact pretty significant metaphysical difference in our view of reality. It is precisely at this point that I believe Hegel makes a mistake, and it is also the point at which contemporary progressive and postmodern thinkers are able to appropriate aspects of his philosophy in ways that I believe distort its original meaning. Many postmodern philosophers trace elements of their outlook back to Hegel's dialectic, especially to this aspect of his thought where universal truths appear to become historically conditioned through their particular manifestations. Hegel understood history as the progressive unfolding of spirit. Because of this, he believed that reality must remain open toward the future. Spirit develops through time, and therefore the future cannot be completely predetermined in the way a static system might suggest. On this point I largely agree with him, however. I believe that this process of development belongs to a lower realm of reality, a realm where universal truth and particular existence meet. What I do not accept is the conclusion that this union somehow transforms the universal itself into something particular. My view is different. I believe that the particular becomes universalized rather than the universal becoming particularized. Universal truth remains eternal and complete, while particular realities are reflections or expressions of that eternity. An eternal truth cannot cease to be eternal simply because it appears within a finite context. It may become reflected in particular forms, but its full reality always remains beyond those forms. The particular is necessarily incomplete, whereas the universal is complete regardless of whether any particular instance exists to express it. In this sense, the universal does not depend upon the particular. The particular depends upon the universal. Particular existence requires participation in eternal meaning, but eternal meaning requires nothing from its particular expressions. The fact that divine necessity has chosen to manifest eternal truths within finite reality does not imply that those truths themselves become finite. Eternity remains what it is even when reflected within time. The example of the pyramidal form illustrates this point. A pyramid may be constructed in different places, by different civilizations, under entirely different historical conditions, yet the essential meaning of the pyramidal structure remains unchanged. The form does not lose its permanence because it appears in a particular object. The reflection changes, but what is reflected remains the same. Although I disagree with many of Schopenhauer's criticisms of Hegel, this is one area where I believe his concerns have some validity. Schopenhauer recognized that an excessive emphasis on becoming and historical progression can create the impression that truth itself is somehow evolving or unstable. In his view, Hegel risked weakening the permanence of truth by understanding reality primarily through development. While I do not accept Schopenhauer's broader rejection of Hegel, I think this particular criticism identifies a genuine tension within Hegel's system. At the same time, it is important to recognize that Hegel is still very far from the relativism often associated with contemporary postmodern thought. Hegel did not believe that truth is whatever society happens to decide at a given moment, nor did he believe that reality is fundamentally uncertain or that all perspectives are equally valid. His philosophy is grounded in the conviction that history unfolds rationally and according to necessity. Spirit has a purpose, and historical development follows a rational trajectory. This is where the concreteness of truth remains present within Hegel's philosophy. Many postmodern thinkers argue that truth is determined by shifting cultural circumstances or by whatever future developments happen to occur. Hegel's position is fundamentally different. For him, the future is not arbitrary. What is often overlooked is that Hegel's other philosophical positions follow directly from his understanding of rational necessity. His views concerning religion, the family, the state, nations, and many other social institutions were not secondary opinions detached from his metaphysics. They were consequences of it. Whether one agrees with those conclusions or not, they formed an essential part of his philosophical system. Hegel regarded such institutions as rational expressions of spirit's development rather than arbitrary human inventions. For this reason, I believe it is difficult to call oneself a genuine Hegelian while rejecting these foundational aspects of his thought. I do not consider myself a Hegelian. I am an idealist. My aim is to study various different philosophers who advocated for this position in order to upgrade my own view of reality, which I believe idealism is by far the best and most rational metaphysical position that we as humanity have constructed and is available right now. And because Hegel was also an idealist, I find much in his philosophy that I admire and that has influenced my own thinking. Yet agreement on certain principles does not justify attributing my views to Hegel where genuine differences exist. I believe it is important to distinguish between our own beliefs and those of the philosophers we study. If my views diverge from Hegel's, then intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that divergence, rather than claiming that Hegel secretly supported positions he never held. To do otherwise would be to reshape his philosophy according to my own preferences, rather than attempting to understand it on its own terms. This is why I resist interpretations that attempt to transform Hegel into something fundamentally different from what he actually was. When we blur the distinction between our own ideas and those of historical thinkers, we risk doing a disservice to both. We lose sight of their genuine contributions while simultaneously weakening the integrity of our own positions. I feel a strong responsibility to avoid this. It seems unfair to use another person's philosophy as a vehicle for ideas they themselves would have rejected. If any thinker could witness their work being employed in support of positions they spent their life opposing, it is difficult to imagine that they would welcome such treatment. Respect for a philosopher's legacy requires the willingness to acknowledge both our agreements and our disagreements with them. A good example of this problem can be seen in the way many contemporary left-wing thinkers interpret Hegel's views on race. From a modern progressive perspective, Hegel's position is often immediately labeled as racist. At the same time, many scholars who wish to preserve Hegel's relevance attempt to reinterpret or obscure his actual views so that they can be reconciled with contemporary political sensibilities. In my opinion, neither approach is satisfactory. It makes little sense to impose our own worldview onto a historical thinker and then judge him according to standards that arise from assumptions he did not share. If we want to understand why a philosopher held a particular belief, we must first attempt to understand the world as that philosopher understood it. We cannot begin with our own assumptions and then force another person's ideas into that framework. To understand Hegel's views on race, one must understand the broader metaphysical system within which those views existed. I intend to discuss this subject in greater detail elsewhere, but my basic point is that Hegel's position appears very different when viewed through his own idealist philosophy than when interpreted through a contemporary progressive lens. Whether one agrees with Hegel or not, it is important to recognize that he was not a materialist, a relativist, or a progressive in the modern sense. His philosophy was rooted in idealism and in the belief that the deepest form of human equality exists at the level of spirit rather than material characteristics. From a materialist perspective, physical differences often become primary markers of identity. Within such a framework, emphasizing racial distinctions can easily be interpreted as racism because material characteristics are treated as fundamentally important. However, an idealist such as Hegel viewed material differences as secondary to the spiritual reality shared by all human beings. In his view, the highest form of equality was not found in physical similarity, but in participation in spirit itself. Whether one finds this convincing or not, it is a fundamentally different framework from modern materialist understandings of equality. What often happens is that contemporary interpreters project their own worldview onto figures from the past, and then condemn them according to standards derived from that worldview. Yet I would argue that many of the same tendencies they criticize are present within their own ideological commitments. The tendency to divide humanity into opposing categories and to direct hostility toward those perceived as outsiders can be found across the political spectrum. In fact, I would argue that both the political right and the political left depend heavily upon defining themselves against some form of opposing group. On the political right, this often takes the form of nationalism and suspicion toward those perceived as foreign or culturally different. The underlying message becomes that certain groups do not belong within the nation. On the political left, the mechanism is different but follows a similar pattern. Instead of focusing on national identity, the division is often framed in universal or global terms. Entire categories of people become symbols of historical oppression and are treated as representatives of broader systems of injustice. The target is no longer merely an outsider to a nation, but a figure portrayed as responsible for wrongs extending across history itself. My point is not that one side is uniquely guilty while the other remains innocent. Rather, I believe both sides are driven by forms of opposition that encourage people to define themselves through conflict with others. The language and justifications differ, but the underlying dynamic remains remarkably similar. I see the deeper source of this problem in the materialistic worldview that dominates much of modern culture. Ironically, many people who condemn social division, greed, prejudice, and exploitation simultaneously embrace a worldview that naturally encourages such outcomes. If material reality is treated as the highest and most important dimension of existence, then people will inevitably organize their values around material distinctions and material competition. A society built upon such assumptions will naturally produce beliefs and behaviors that reflect them. As a result, people often create the very problems they later denounce. They construct a worldview that encourages conflict and then condemn society for becoming conflict-ridden. In symbolic terms, this resembles what many religious traditions describe as following the path of the devil. It means elevating one's own perspective above everything else, insisting upon one's own correctness, and then participating in the destructive consequences of those beliefs while blaming others for the outcome. This is one reason why I regard much of modern leftist ideology as a form of religion. Every worldview contains a highest principle, a source of value that occupies the place traditionally associated with the sacred. In many traditional religions, ultimate authority belongs to God. Human beings are not the final measure of truth or reality. No individual stands above the divine order. In such a framework, all people are equal precisely because none of them occupy the highest position. By contrast, I see modern secular ideologies as increasingly placing humanity itself in that highest position. Human desires, preferences, and subjective experiences become the ultimate standards by which reality is judged. Society then becomes a struggle between competing groups seeking to impose their own vision of reality upon others. The result is a continual competition for power, recognition, and control. Many people will reject this characterization, but I believe the consequences are visible throughout contemporary culture. Paradoxically, some forms of postmodern thought deny the existence of objective truth while simultaneously treating human preference as capable of determining reality itself. In practice, reality becomes whatever individuals or groups desire it to be. To me, this position is contradictory because truth and reality are inseparable. If objective truth is denied, then the very notion of a stable reality is undermined as well. For this reason, I define religion more broadly than is commonly done. Religion is not merely a set of doctrines about God, heaven, or the supernatural. Religion is the structure of ultimate values through which people interpret existence. Whatever occupies the highest place in a person's hierarchy of meaning functions as their religion. Even opposition to religion can become a religious position when it serves as the organizing principle of one's worldview. From this perspective, many movements that present themselves as secular or anti-religious nevertheless function religiously. Political identities, ideological commitments, and social causes can all take on this role. Various contemporary movements often operate as extensions of a broader liberal democratic worldview centered upon individual autonomy and subjective self-definition. Whether these positions are described as atheistic or secular is, in a sense, beside the point. Atheism itself can become one doctrine among many within a larger system of meaning. My concern is that these modern belief systems increasingly encourage humanity to rebel against conditions necessary for its own flourishing. Symbols, doctrines, and ideological commitments often become more important than reality itself. As a result, social life becomes characterized by growing forms of conflict. Conflict between political factions, conflict between social groups, conflict between men and women, and conflict between competing identities. I see these developments as symptoms of a broader worldview that has lost contact with the idea of reality as a living, meaningful whole. When reality is reduced to matter, power, and subjective preference, society naturally moves toward fragmentation and struggle. In that sense, the conflicts of modern life are not accidental, but arise from the deeper assumptions upon which the culture itself has been built.